The attic was the coldest room in the house, and that was why she used it. It was a little after 2 in the morning in a townhouse in The Hague, in the winter of 1942, and a woman who called herself by a name that was not her own sat on an overturned crate with a set of headphones pressed to one ear and a Morse key under 2 fingers that had gone white at the tips. The set in front of her was no larger than a small suitcase, and it was tuned to a frequency that, if anyone found it, would be enough to hang her. She tapped 3 letters, a pause, 3 more, and she counted in her head, because the first rule they had taught her was that you never stayed on the air longer than 20 minutes. Below her, in the street, an engine slowed. Then it idled. Then she heard, very faintly, the whir of a rotating antenna on the roof of a van. A direction finder, sweeping the rooftops of the city for exactly the signal she was sending. She did not stop tapping. She had 9 words left to send, and somewhere across the channel a man in a basement in London was waiting for them, and so she finished the message and she pulled the plug, and she sat in the dark and listened to the engine in the street pull away. That woman was real. There were hundreds like her, scattered across a continent that had gone completely dark. To understand why she was in that attic, why anyone would climb into a freezing room in an occupied city to tap out 9 words that might kill them, you have to go back 2 years, to the months when the lights of Europe went out one country at a time, and the silence that followed felt to the people living inside it like it might last forever. It began on the 1st of September, 1939, when German divisions crossed the Polish frontier before dawn. The world had been bracing for it, and still it came as a kind of shock, the speed of it above all. Poland was not a small or a cowardly country. It fought, but it was attacked from the west by Germany and, 2 weeks later, from the east by the Soviet Union, and a nation caught between 2 giants in the autumn of 1939 had nowhere to stand. By the first week of October it was over. Warsaw, which had endured weeks of bombardment, surrendered. And across the rest of Europe, in Paris and London and Amsterdam and Oslo, people read the newspapers and felt the cold breath of something coming closer. For a few strange months, nothing happened. The French called it the drôle de guerre, the joke war. The British called it the phony war. 2 great armies sat facing each other across the western frontier and did almost nothing, and people allowed themselves to believe, against the evidence, that perhaps the worst was already behind them. They were wrong. The quiet was not peace. It was a held breath. In April of 1940 the breath let go. Germany struck north into Denmark and Norway. Denmark fell in a single day. Its small army, its king, its government simply overwhelmed before they could form a response. Norway fought longer, in the fjords and the snow, with British and French help, but by June it too had fallen. And then, in the second week of May, the real blow landed in the west. It is difficult now to convey how stunning it was. France in 1940 was widely considered to have the most powerful army in the world. It had held the German army for 4 terrible years in the last war. Behind it stood the British Empire. And in 6 weeks, it was gone. German armored columns broke through the Ardennes, the forested country the French had thought too dense for tanks, and raced for the Channel coast, cutting the Allied armies in 2. At Dunkirk, the British clawed 1/3 men off the beaches in a flotilla of warships and fishing boats and pleasure craft, and called it a miracle because it was. But a rescue is not a victory. The men came home, and they left a continent behind them. On the 14th of June, German troops marched into Paris. The city had been declared open, undefended, to spare it from destruction, and so there was no battle, only the sound of boots on the Champs-Élysées, and shutters closing, and a population standing on the pavements in silence watching an army that was not theirs take possession of their capital. A photograph survives of a Frenchman in the crowd that day, a middle-aged man in a hat, his face contorted with weeping that he is plainly trying and failing to control. He is not weeping for himself. He is weeping for the thing that has just ended. Within weeks, the map of Europe had been redrawn into a single color. The Netherlands had surrendered after the bombing of Rotterdam flattened the heart of the city in a quarter of an hour. Belgium had fallen. Luxembourg had been swallowed without a fight. France was split, the north and the Atlantic coast under direct German occupation, the south governed from the spa town of Vichy by a government that had chosen accommodation over resistance. From the North Cape of Norway to the Pyrenees, from the western edge of Poland to the Atlantic, the lights had gone out. And under that darkness, for the first time, sat the ordinary people of a dozen nations, waking up each morning to find that the country they had gone to sleep in no longer existed. What did that actually feel like, to live under occupation? This is the part the maps cannot show you. Felt first like silence. Not the absence of noise, but the absence of certain freedoms so basic that no one had ever thought to name them. You could no longer say what you thought in a cafe, because you did not know who was listening. You could no longer print what you believed because the presses now answered to other men. The radio in the corner of the room, which had once carried your own language and your own news, now carried someone else's version of the truth, and the broadcasts you wanted to hear, the ones coming faintly across the channel from London, were forbidden, and listening to them was a crime. There were new rules for everything. Curfews that emptied the streets after dark. Identity papers to be produced on demand. Ration cards. Checkpoints. A whole apparatus of permission laid over the surface of daily life, so that even buying bread or visiting your mother across town became an act that required documents and luck. And it felt, beneath all of that, like helplessness. The armies had been beaten. The governments had fled or surrendered. The men with rifles and tanks who were supposed to protect you had been swept off the board in a matter of weeks. What could one person possibly do? One schoolteacher, one farmer, one railway clerk, against the machinery that now ran the continent. The honest answer, in the summer of 1940, seemed to be nothing. Nothing at all. Keep your head down. Survive. Wait, but here is the thing about helplessness. It is almost never total. And in the smallest corners of occupied Europe, in ways so quiet they could be missed entirely, people began, without orders, without organization, without any real hope of changing the war, to refuse. It started with gestures that would have seemed almost laughable if the stakes had not been so high. In Norway, people began wearing paper clips on their lapels, an ordinary office paper clip, invented, they believed, by a Norwegian, as a silent way of saying I belong to this country and not to you. It was nothing. Changed nothing. And the occupation authorities took it seriously enough to ban it, because they understood something the people who wore it perhaps only half understood. That a symbol is a crack, and cracks spread. In the cities of France and the Low Countries, the first act of resistance for many was simply a hand reaching out in the dark to tear down a poster. The walls of every occupied town were papered with proclamations, new regulations, lists of the forbidden, announcements designed to make the new order feel permanent and total. And in the night, someone would walk past one, glance both ways, and rip it from the wall. A torn poster did not win anything, but it left a mark. It said, to the next person who passed, that someone here had not accepted this. That somewhere in this silent, obedient city, there was at least one person who still answered to a different authority. And then there was the radio. Across occupied Europe, in defiance of every order, people kept their wireless sets and hid them, under floorboards, behind false walls, in the lining of a chair, and gathered around them after curfew with the volume turned down so low that a family had to lean in shoulder to hear. They were listening for London, for the BBC, whose broadcasts in their own languages told them what was really happening in the war, and reminded them, simply by existing, that the free world had not forgotten they were there. To be caught listening could mean prison. People did it anyway, night after night, because a voice from outside the darkness was worth the risk, because as long as you could hear it, you were not entirely alone. These were tiny things. Paper clip, a torn poster, a hidden radio. Measured against the German army, they were nothing at all, and the people who did them knew it. But each one carried a private, dangerous truth, that the conquest of a country is not the same as the conquest of the people in it. You can occupy the land. You can take the cities and the railways and the radio stations. But you cannot, it turns out, quite reach inside every single person and make them agree. And from that gap, that small, stubborn space between what was conquered and what was not, something more dangerous began to grow. Because the next step was not a gesture. It was a choice that could not be taken back. And it usually began with a stranger at the door. Consider what it meant, in the autumn of 1940, to find an airman in your barn. All across the occupied continent, the air war overhead was raining men down onto the fields below. British and later American flyers whose aircraft had been hit on the long runs to and from Germany, who had jumped into the dark and drifted down by parachute into fields and forests and back gardens in countries crawling with enemy troops. A downed airman in occupied Europe was, in the cold arithmetic of the war, an enormous prize, a trained crewman who, if he could be smuggled home, would fly again. The Germans knew this, and they hunted them. And so when a farmer in Belgium or northern France went out at dawn and found a young man in a torn flight jacket hiding in the hay, frightened, unable to speak the language, that farmer faced a decision more total than any he had ever made. He could turn the airmen in. It was the safe thing, the legal thing under the new order, and some did it. Or he could close the barn door and bring the young man food and hide him. And in that single act, he and his entire family crossed a line from which there was no coming back. Sheltering an enemy airman was punishable by death. Not just for the man who did it, for his wife, for his children, for anyone in the house. And yet, again and again, across the whole of occupied Europe, ordinary people opened the barn door and chose the airman. They fed him and clothed him in civilian clothes, and then, not knowing what else to do, they began to look for someone, anyone, who might know how to move him along. That impulse, multiplied 10,000 times across a continent, is how the first escape lines were born. Not from headquarters, from kitchens, from the simple, terrifying decision of a farmer's wife to hide one frightened boy, and then to ask a cousin in the next town whether he knew a way to get him to the coast. Lines began to form, link by link, person by person. A chain of households, each one knowing only the next, passing airmen south toward the Pyrenees and the Spanish border, or to a quiet stretch of coast where a boat might come. The people in these chains were not soldiers. They were nuns and shopkeepers and teenage girls and retired clerks. They had no weapons. Their only protection was secrecy and the willingness of every link to die rather than name the next. It was astonishing. It was also, in the grand strategy of the war, almost nothing, and the people doing it knew that too. A torn poster, a sheltered airman, a radio hidden under the floor, a frequency tapped out in a freezing attic at 2 in the morning. Each act was a single candle held up against a darkness that covered an entire continent. Each one risked everything and, on its own, accomplished almost nothing measurable. The German occupation did not tremble because a Norwegian wore a paperclip. The war was not turned by one farmer in one barn. And yet here was the question that hung over all of it, the question that no one in those kitchens and attics in 1940 could yet answer. There was clearly something here. A continent full of people who had been beaten but not, it turned out, broken. Thousands upon thousands of individual men and women, in every occupied country, ready to take appalling risks for nothing more than the refusal to surrender. That was real. That was a force of some kind. But it was scattered. It was uncoordinated. It was 1,000 candles in 1,000 separate rooms, none of them aware of the others, none of them connected to any plan, none of them supplied with so much as a pistol or a code or an order. It was courage without a shape. The Germans were not afraid of scattered courage. Scattered courage could be hunted down one farmhouse at a time. What might actually threaten them was something else entirely, that all of this raw defiance, all of this willingness, might somehow be found and linked and armed and pointed, that someone might reach across the channel into the darkness and turn 10,000 isolated acts of conscience into a weapon. The men with the power to attempt that were sitting in London in the summer of 1940, watching their last ally fall, with no army left on the continent and no obvious way to ever get one back there. They were beginning to understand that the war they had lost on the battlefields of France might have to be won. Instead, in the barns and the attics and the back rooms of the very countries they had just been driven out of. The question was how. The question was whether a handful of candles, scattered across a continent in the dark, could ever be gathered into a single flame. And then, in July of 1940, a sentence was spoken in London that would set fire to all of it. In the summer of 1940, Britain stood almost entirely alone, and the men who ran its government understood, with the particular clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose, that the ordinary instruments of war were not going to be enough. The army that had gone to France was gone, not destroyed. Most of the men had been pulled off the beaches at Dunkirk in the last week of May and the first week of June, a deliverance that felt, at the time, like a miracle and looked, on the maps, like a catastrophe. What came back to England was an army without its guns, without its tanks, without the equipment that had been abandoned in the dunes and the ditches of northern France. 400,000 rifles, 20,000 vehicles, 1,000 artillery pieces. All of it left behind. The British Expeditionary Force returned as a crowd of exhausted men in the uniforms they stood in. And across the Channel, from the cliffs of Calais, German officers could look through their field glasses on a clear day and see the white coast of England. There was, in the cold arithmetic of it, almost nothing standing between Hitler and the conquest of Western Europe entire. France would sign its armistice on the 22nd of June. The Low Countries were gone. Norway was gone. Poland, where it had all started, had been gone for 9 months. From the North Cape of Norway to the Pyrenees, a single power now controlled the coastline of the continent, and that power had an army that had not lost a campaign in nearly 2 years. The question that hung over Whitehall in those weeks was not how Britain would win. No one of sound mind was asking that question yet. The question was how Britain would fight at all, how a nation with no foothold on the continent, no army able to land there, and no prospect of one for years, could do anything but wait behind its moat and hope. And it was into that question, in the second week of July, that Winston Churchill dropped 4 words that would define a secret war. He had been Prime Minister for 2 months. He was 65 years old, a man whose career had been written off more times than anyone could count, who had spent the 1930s in what he himself called his wilderness years, warning a country that did not want to listen about a danger it did not want to see. Now the danger had arrived exactly as he had described it, and the country that had ignored him had handed him the wheel at the precise moment the ship seemed certain to go down. On the 16th of July, 1940, a memorandum was prepared establishing a new and secret organization. Its purpose was sabotage and subversion in the occupied territories. To coordinate, the document said, all action by way of subversion and sabotage against the enemy overseas. Hugh Dalton, the Minister of Economic Warfare, would oversee it. And Churchill, according to the account that has come down to us, gave Dalton his instruction in a single phrase that has outlived almost everything else about that summer. And now, he said, set Europe ablaze. It is worth pausing on how strange that idea was. How genuinely, radically, almost unthinkably strange it was to the men who heard it. Because Britain was a nation that prided itself, above nearly all else, on the rules, on fair play, on a way of making war that, however brutal it became in practice, still imagined itself as the work of uniformed men meeting other uniformed men on a defined field, under a code that both sides at least pretended to honor. The British officer class had been raised on it. Eton and Sandhurst, the regiment, the mess, the idea that there were things a gentleman simply did not do. You did not shoot a man in the back. You did not poison a well. You did not dress as a civilian and slip a knife between someone's ribs in a dark street and walk away whistling. And now the Prime Minister was proposing, in effect, to build an entire organization devoted to doing exactly those things. To arm civilians. To teach ordinary men and women, school teachers, clerks, housewives, students, how to blow up bridges and derail trains and kill sentries silently in the dark. To wage a war with no front line, no uniforms, no quarter, no rules. A war that the men who fought it would have to fight knowing that capture meant not a prison camp but a cellar, an interrogation, and almost certainly a wall and a firing squad, if they were lucky enough to die that cleanly. The men who built this thing called it, with a kind of grim public school humor, ungentlemanly warfare. The phrase was not entirely a joke. It carried the unease of people who knew they were crossing a line their whole upbringing had taught them not to cross, and who had decided, in the summer of 1940, that there was no longer any choice. The organization they built was given a name designed to mean nothing. The Special Operations Executive. A piece of bureaucratic camouflage so bland it could have been a department that audited railway timetables. Within the small circle who knew of its existence, it acquired other names, half affectionate and half warning. The Baker Street Irregulars, after the London Street where its headquarters sat, and after Sherlock Holmes's gang of street urchins who went where the police could not. The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. The firm. Its headquarters were as anonymous as its name. Number 64 Baker Street, an undistinguished office block in central London. The kind of building a man could walk past 1,000 times without a second glance. There was no sign. The people who worked there told their families they had dull jobs in some inter-services research bureau, or in a corner of the War Office no one cared about. Wives did not know what their husbands did. Husbands did not know what their wives did. The whole enterprise lived behind a wall of deliberate, cultivated dullness, because dullness was the best armor it had. But behind that anonymous door, men and a remarkable number of women were sitting down to invent, more or less from nothing, an entire science of secret war. And almost nobody in the British government wanted them to exist at all. This is the part of the story that the films tend to leave out, the part where the greatest enemies of Britain's secret war were not in Berlin, but in London, because the established intelligence services hated the SOE from the moment it drew breath. The Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, the gentlemen spies, the quiet professionals who gathered information, regarded the newcomers as reckless amateurs who were going to ruin everything. And there was a logic to their fury that was not merely turf and jealousy, though there was plenty of both. The spy's entire craft depends on silence, on invisibility, on networks of agents who watch and listen and report and are never, ever noticed. The SOE existed to do the opposite, to make noise, to blow things up, to draw the enemy's attention, and his reprisals, down onto exactly the populations through which the quiet spies needed to move unseen. Every bridge the SOE destroyed brought the Gestapo flooding into a region. Every train it derailed meant arrests, interrogations, hostages shot in village squares. And the men of MI6 argued, with cold conviction, that each spectacular act of sabotage cost them the patient, invisible networks they had spent years building. A blown bridge could be rebuilt in days. A burned network could take years to replace, and the men in it would be dead. It was a real argument. It was made by serious people. And it meant that from its first day to nearly its last, the SOE had to fight a war on two fronts, one against the German occupation of Europe, and one against the suspicion, the obstruction, and at times the outright sabotage of its own government's other secret arms. There were stories, never fully proven but never fully dismissed, of operations betrayed, of resources withheld, of a rivalry so poisonous that men died for it. The new firm had to beg for aircraft to drop its agents, beg for the radio frequencies to talk to them, beg for a seat at tables where decisions were made. The skeptics in Whitehall did not simply doubt the SOE. Many of them wished sincerely that it had never been born. And across the Atlantic, in a country not yet even in the war, a man was watching all of this with intense and acquisitive interest. His name was William Donovan, and everyone who knew him called him Wild Bill. He had earned the name in the trenches of the First World War, where he had commanded an infantry battalion of the so-called Fighting 69th, the storied Irish Regiment of New York, and had come home with the Medal of Honor and a reputation for a kind of physical courage that bordered on the suicidal. He had been wounded, gassed, decorated again and again, and he had led men over the top into machine gun fire with a calm that the survivors never forgot. After the war, he had become a Wall Street lawyer, a Republican, a man of money and influence, but the soldier never entirely left him, and neither did the appetite for the dangerous and the unconventional. In the summer of 1940, with America still officially neutral and a great many Americans determined to stay out of Europe's war entirely, President Roosevelt sent Donovan across the Atlantic on a quiet mission to find out whether Britain would survive. He was not a spy. He held no official intelligence post. He was a private citizen with the president's confidence, and he spent his weeks in London being shown things that ordinary visitors did not see. And what he saw changed him. He saw the Baker Street operation in its first chaotic months. He saw the men plotting a secret war across an occupied continent. He came back to Washington convinced that America, if it was going to enter this war, and Donovan was certain it would, needed something the United States had never had: a Central Intelligence Service. An organization that would not merely gather secrets but act on them, that could run agents and finance resistance and wage exactly the kind of ungentlemanly war the British were inventing. The American military establishment thought he was mad. The Army had its intelligence branch, the Navy had its own, the FBI guarded the home front and had no intention of sharing. And into this jealous patchwork Donovan proposed to insert a single new agency that would answer to the president and trespass on everyone's ground at once. J. Edgar Hoover loathed the idea. The service chiefs resented it. Donovan had to fight, in Washington, very nearly the same battle the SOE was fighting in London. The battle to convince his own side that a new kind of war required a new kind of weapon, and that the men who already held the old weapons would have to make room. He won, slowly. In 1941, Roosevelt named him Coordinator of Information, a title as deliberately vague as Special Operations Executive, and from that bland office would eventually grow the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the wartime ancestor of the modern Central Intelligence Agency. Donovan and the British became close, sometimes uneasy partners. The SOE taught the Americans much of what it knew. American money and American aircraft and American manpower would, in time, pour into the secret war the British had started alone. But in that first year it was the older, smaller, poorer service in London that held the knowledge, and the Americans who came, hat in hand, to learn. So now there was a mandate. There was an organization, however embattled. There was, across the ocean, a partner being born. There were men of vision and men of fury, ministers and lawyers and soldiers, arguing in the corridors of two governments about whether a secret war was salvation or folly. But none of that, in the cold light of an autumn morning in 1940, amounted to anything yet. Because a mandate is not a weapon. An organization is not a victory. Churchill could order Europe set ablaze, and Donovan could dream of an American Secret Service, and the men at Baker Street could draw up their plans on their anonymous upper floors. And at the end of all of it, the entire enterprise came down to a single, almost absurdly difficult problem that no memorandum could solve. Somebody actually had to go. Somebody had to climb into an aircraft in the dark, somewhere over the south of England, and be carried across the channel into the heart of occupied Europe, and step out into a black field in a country crawling with secret police, and disappear into a hostile population and survive. Somebody had to learn to live a lie so complete that it would hold up under interrogation. To carry a radio that, the moment it transmitted, became a death sentence the enemy could trace. To kill, if killing was required, and to keep their nerve in a world where every stranger might be an informer and every knock at the door might be the end. The men at Baker Street had the idea. What they did not yet have were the people who could carry it out, and no army on earth trained for this. There was no manual. There was no school. There were no veterans to teach the recruits, because the kind of war they were preparing for had never quite been fought this way before. So before a single agent could be dropped into a single field, the firm had to answer the hardest question of all. Not whether to fight this war. Churchill had settled that. The question was whether it was even possible to take an ordinary man or an ordinary woman, a clerk, a teacher, a girl who spoke good French, and turn them in a matter of months into someone who could be parachuted into the most dangerous place on earth and live long enough to matter. To find out, they would need somewhere to do it. Quiet houses in the Scottish Highlands, far from any prying eye. Instructors drawn from the shadowy edges of the old empire. Burglars and big-game hunters and policemen who had learned violence in the back streets of Shanghai. And a process brutal and improvised and utterly unsentimental, designed to take a human being apart and build, out of the pieces, a secret soldier. The schools were where the wild idea would either become real or die. There is a house in the south of England, in a valley near the village of Beaulieu in Hampshire, that during the war did not appear on any list a stranger could consult. It had a gravel drive and a walled garden and the kind of quiet that money buys. And in the spring of 1942, a young woman who had grown up speaking French at her mother's knee was driven up that drive in a car with the curtains partly drawn. And she was not told the name of the house, and she was not told the name of the village, and when she arrived she was given a new name that was not her own. This was deliberate. Everything about the place was deliberate. The men who ran it had decided, after careful thought, that the fewer things she knew that she did not need to know, the longer she might live. The organization that owned the house was called the Special Operations Executive. It had been created in July of 1940, in the worst summer Britain had known, when France had fallen in 6 weeks and the British Army had left its equipment on the beaches of Dunkirk and the whole of occupied Europe lay under German administration with no obvious way to reach it. Winston Churchill, casting about for something, anything, that could be done against an enemy that now controlled the continent from the Atlantic to the Soviet border, had given the new organization an instruction that became famous in the small circle of people permitted to know it existed. Set Europe ablaze, he said. It was a sentence with no manual attached. Nobody in the British government had ever tried to do what Churchill was now asking. There was no school for it because the thing itself had not existed before. So they built the school. They built it, in fact, out of the country houses of the English gentry, requisitioned estates scattered across Scotland and southern England, each one assigned a number and a function, the whole network referred to internally, with the dry humor of the people who designed it as the schools for the bourgeois. Cooks and clerks and housewives and dockworkers and university students and a great many people who, in the ordinary course of their lives, would never have learned to do any of the things they were about to be taught. Because that was the point. The work that needed doing in occupied Europe could not be done by soldiers in uniform. It had to be done by people who looked like nobody in particular, who could stand in a queue for a tram in Lyon, or buy a railway ticket in Bordeaux, or walk past a German checkpoint carrying a suitcase and draw no second glance. Ordinary people. And so the schools took ordinary people and, over a few short months, attempted to teach them how to survive in a place where being noticed could kill them. The journey began, for most of them, in the Highlands of Scotland. In the wild country west of Fort William, around the estates of Airoseg, on a peninsula of bog and rock and freezing rain that ran down to the Grey Sea, the SOE established its paramilitary schools. The area was sealed off, declared a protected zone, emptied of civilians, accessible only by a single road and a railway line that the security services watched. And here, in a landscape that did not forgive carelessness, recruits learned the first hard truths of the trade. They learned to march for hours over ground that pulled the boots off your feet. They learned to read a map and move by night and live off what they carried. And they learned, from instructors who had themselves done these things in places they were not permitted to name, the parts of the work that had no civilian equivalent at all. They learned how to kill a man silently. This was taught, in part, by two former Shanghai policemen named William Fairbairn and Eric Sykes, who had spent decades keeping order in one of the most violent cities on earth and who had arrived at a philosophy of close combat that owed nothing to the gentlemanly traditions of boxing or fencing. There were no rules where the recruits were going, and so Fairbairn taught them that there should be no rules in how they trained. He taught the edge of the hand and the heel of the boot and the precise soft places of the human body where pressure ends a life. He had co-designed with Sykes a slim double-edged fighting knife with a long thin blade made for one purpose, and he taught them how to use it and where, and he did so without sentiment because sentiment in the moment he was preparing them for was simply a slower way to die. The recruits were, many of them, gentle people. A literature teacher. A clerk from a perfume house. They learned these things anyway, because the alternative was to send them to France unable to defend their own lives. And then, having learned to fight, they learned to break things. The whole purpose of the SOE, in the end, was sabotage, the patient, secret destruction of the machinery that allowed Germany to hold Europe and wage war. So the recruits went to the demolition schools and learned the chemistry of plastic explosive, a substance that could be molded like clay and was stable enough to carry in a coat pocket and would, with the right detonator, fold a steel railway line or drop a bridge or wreck the turbines of a power station. They learned where to place a charge on a locomotive so that the damage could not be quickly repaired. They learned to read the architecture of a factory and find the single irreplaceable machine whose loss would stop the whole line. They learned that the most efficient sabotage was often the smallest. A handful of grit in a bearing, a doctored gauge, a quiet word that sent a shipment to the wrong destination, and that the saboteur who blew up a bridge in a shower of sparks was frequently a saboteur who had failed, because he had announced himself, and a saboteur who is noticed does not last. The best work left no fingerprints. The best work looked to the Germans like bad luck. But before any of that mattered, before the knife or the explosive could be of any use at all, the recruit had to be able to live a lie. And that, more than anything taught in the Highlands, was the heart of the schools at Beaulieu. The finishing schools, they were sometimes called, 12 houses scattered across the Beaulieu estate where the recruits who had survived the physical training came to learn the subtler and far more dangerous art of being someone else. Here there were no assault courses. Here a man sat across a desk from you in a quiet room and built you a new life from nothing. You were given a cover story, a name, a birthplace, a trade, a reason for being wherever you were going to be, and then you were required to live inside it so completely that it became more real to you than your own history. Where did you go to school? What was your mother's maiden name? What did you do last Tuesday? The instructors would wake a recruit at 3 in the morning, switch on a light in his eyes, and bark questions at him in French. And if he answered in English or hesitated over the name of the village he was supposed to have grown up in, he failed. And failing here was not an embarrassment. It was a lesson in the manner of one's own future death. Because the Gestapo would do exactly this. They would wake you at 3 in the morning. They would shine a light in your eyes. The cover had to go down to the smallest things. Recruits were taught that an agent could be betrayed by the cut of his clothes, by the metal of his fillings, by the way he held a cigarette or queued for bread or looked the wrong way crossing a street in a country that drove on the right. They were taught to surrender their English habits one by one. To stop, the instructors said, being British, because Britishness was a smell that a trained eye could catch across a railway platform. And they were taught the psychology of it, which was the hardest part of all. That the loneliness of living a false life among people who would hand you to the enemy if they knew the truth was a weight that broke strong men, and that they would carry it without relief, sometimes for months, with no one to confide in and no way home. They were taught, too, the tradecraft of contact, how to recognize a fellow agent without speaking, how to pass a message, how to arrange a meeting so that if one party was being followed the other could walk on by. They learned the dead drop and the brush pass and the safe house and the danger signal. The flower pot moved to a windowsill, the curtain drawn at the wrong hour, that meant turn around, do not enter, the house is blown. They were taught to memorize rather than to write, because anything written down was evidence, and evidence in the wrong hands killed not only the agent but everyone whose name the paper carried. And there was one skill, more arcane than the others, that some of them were taught in a small room with a single lamp. How to pick a lock. How to ease open a desk drawer in an office where you had no business. How to copy a key from an impression in soft wax. How to enter a locked room and leave it locked behind you so that no one would ever know you had been there. It looked, when the instructor's hands did it, like a magic trick. It was, in fact, patience reduced to a craft, the slow and silent persuasion of a mechanism, performed in the dark, often with a sentry on the other side of the door. Many recruits never mastered it. The ones who did found it a strange thing to know, this burglar's art, taught by the British government in a requisition manor house to a clerk who 6 months earlier had never broken any law in his life. But of all the trades taught in the secret schools, there was one that stood apart from the others. One that everyone in the SOE understood to be different, because the people who did it died faster than anyone else. They were called wireless operators. And theirs was the most dangerous job in the entire war. The reason was a matter of physics, and there was no getting around it. An agent in occupied France could not telephone London. He could not post a letter. The only way to send what he learned back across the channel, the troop movements, the bombing targets, the requests for weapons and money and more agents, was to transmit it by Morse code over a radio set. And the moment he switched that set on, he began, quite literally, to broadcast his own location to the enemy. The Germans understood this perfectly. They had built an entire apparatus around it. In the cities of occupied Europe, they ran direction-finding stations, fixed antennas that could take a bearing on any clandestine transmission the instant it began. And when the fixed stations had narrowed a transmission to a district, they sent out the vans. These were detector vehicles, sometimes disguised as ordinary delivery vans, sometimes as ambulances, that crawled the streets with rotating antennas hidden inside, closing on the signal street by street. In the final approach, when the operator was thought to be inside a single building, the Germans would send men on foot, carrying detectors strapped to their bodies under their coats, a meter on the wrist that twitched as they walked past the right door. They could fix a transmitting set under good conditions in well under half an hour, which meant the wireless operator worked against a clock that he could not see and could not stop. He coded his message. He strung his aerial, a length of wire that had to run the length of a room or out a window, an aerial that itself could betray him if the wrong neighbor saw it. He tapped out his traffic in Morse, every keystroke a fresh fix for the men in the vans, and the longer the message, the closer they came. The operators were trained to keep transmissions short, a few minutes, never more, and to change location constantly, never sending twice from the same house, lugging a heavy suitcase set across a city full of checkpoints, because that suitcase, if opened at a control, was a death sentence with no possible explanation. They worked alone most of the time. They lived inside a discipline that allowed no error, because a single careless minute on the key could finish them, and the network around them, in an afternoon. And the statistics were merciless. The men who ran the SOE's French operations calculated, soberly, that a wireless operator dropped into occupied France could expect to survive, on average, about 6 weeks before being captured. 6 weeks. Not killed in battle, most of them, taken in a raid on a safe house in the back of a detector van, by men who kicked in a door while the set was still warm. What happened after the capture was worse than the capture, and everyone in the schools knew it because the Gestapo did not simply imprison a captured operator. They tried to turn his radio against the people who had sent him. This was the nightmare that haunted the whole enterprise, the captured set, played back by German hands. If an operator was taken with his radio and his codes and could be made, by whatever means, to keep transmitting, then London might go on receiving messages that seemed to come from a living agent and were in fact dictated by the enemy. Whole networks were rolled up this way. Agents and weapons and money were parachuted, on the strength of those messages, straight into the arms of the men who had broken them. To guard against it, every operator was given a security check. A deliberate small error, a particular letter dropped or doubled at an agreed point in the message, that would silently tell London the operator was free, and whose absence would scream that he was not. It was a thin thread of safety. It depended, in the end, on the people in London reading the signs correctly, and on a captured operator finding the courage, under interrogation that does not bear describing, to leave the check out and let the omission speak for him, knowing what it would cost him to be caught doing it. These were the people the secret schools were built to make. Not soldiers in the ordinary sense. Not men who would fight in a line with their comrades beside them and a flag overhead. These were people trained to be alone in the dark, to lie for their lives every waking hour, to carry a knife and an explosive and a radio that was also a death warrant, and to do it in a foreign city where capture meant not an honorable prison camp but a cellar, an interrogation, and very often a wall at dawn. They knew the odds. The schools made sure they knew the odds. And what is hardest to grasp at this distance is that knowing the odds, they went anyway. The last lesson, for those who passed, was the one that put them on the other side of the channel. They were taken to airfields in the flat country of Bedfordshire and Cambridgeshire, to squadrons that flew at night and asked no questions, and they were trained to jump. A few practiced descents by day onto soft grass with an instructor's voice in the ear, and then, on a moonlit night when the weather was right and the moon was full enough to see a field in France from 2,000 feet, the real thing. They put on a padded suit over their civilian clothes, the clothes cut and labeled to French patterns, every English thing stripped from their pockets. They were handed a flask, sometimes a pill they did not discuss. They climbed into the belly of a converted bomber and sat in the dark on the cold metal floor while the aircraft droned south over the channel and the gunners watched the sky, and one by one the lights of England fell away behind them. Imagine sitting there, a schoolteacher, a clerk, a young woman who 6 months ago had never held a pistol, now strapped into a flying machine over the sea at midnight, with a false name sewn into her memory and the whole apparatus of a hostile state waiting somewhere below in the dark. The dispatcher kneels by the hole in the aircraft's floor. He holds up a hand. The red light glows by the opening. Below, in the blackness of occupied France, 3 small fires flicker in the corner of a field. The reception party, the men and women of the resistance who have crept out past the curfew to bring you in, who are risking their own lives and their families' lives to stand in that field and wait. The light turns green. The dispatcher's hand comes down, and the agent goes out through the floor into the rushing dark and the cold air, the canopy snapping open above, and there is a moment of silence, swinging beneath the silk between the stars and the fires, before the ground of France comes up to meet them, and the secret war, the real war, the one fought in farmhouses and back rooms and the cellars of the Gestapo, begins. For waiting below were the networks, and what they built and what was done to them is the next part of this story. In the summer of 1942, a young woman named Jean pedaled a bicycle along a country road south of Tours, in the Valley of the Loire, with 11,000 French francs sewn into the lining of her coat and a sheet of folded silk hidden inside the frame of the bicycle itself. She was 22 years old. The silk carried a coded message, written in a cipher she did not understand, addressed to a man she had never met. If she was stopped and searched and the money or the silk was found, she would be arrested, and after she was arrested she would be interrogated, and the people who interrogated her in the basement of the building on the Avenue Foch in Paris were very good at what they did. She knew all of this. She pedaled anyway, because the man waiting at the far end of the road needed the money to pay the farmers who were hiding 3 downed British airmen in a barn, and there was no one else to carry it. This is what the secret war in France actually looked like. Not the dramatic image we carry of men in berets blowing up bridges, though that happened too. It looked like a young woman on a bicycle, in a thin coat, on an ordinary road, carrying a folded piece of silk that could kill her. The war in occupied France was fought, more than anywhere else, by people whose weapon was simply the willingness to keep moving while carrying something forbidden. To understand how a network of these people came to exist at all, you have to understand what occupation actually meant on the ground, because it was not, for most of France, a matter of constant violence. It was quieter and stranger than that. The Germans had arrived in June of 1940, and by 1941 the occupation had settled into something almost routine. German soldiers drank coffee in the cafés of Paris and bought postcards and photographed the cathedral at Chartres. Trains ran. Shops opened. To a casual eye, life continued. And it was precisely inside that appearance of normality that the resistance had to build itself, invisibly, slowly, in the spaces between ordinary lives. The networks the French called réseaux did not spring into existence as armies. They grew the way underground things grow, from individual decisions made by individual people. A railway clerk who began, quietly, noting the contents and destinations of German military trains. A schoolteacher who agreed to hide a parachuted radio set in the attic of the village school. A doctor who treated a wounded man and asked no questions and then, weeks later, agreed to treat another. Each of these people knew only a few others. That was the entire architecture of survival. A réseau was not a chain of command. It was a web of small, deliberate ignorances, each member knowing as little as possible about the others, so that if one was caught, the damage stopped there. And the most essential people in that web, the ones without whom nothing else could function, were the couriers. It is one of the quiet truths of the French resistance that the work of moving information and money and people was carried, overwhelmingly, by women. This was not an accident, and it was not sentimental. It was tactical. A young Frenchman traveling between towns in 1942 was a suspicious thing. He should be at a labor draft or in a prison camp or accounted for somewhere. A young woman on a bicycle with a basket of vegetables was invisible. The Germans looked through her. She could pass a checkpoint that would have stopped any man, precisely because the occupiers could not imagine her as a threat. The resistance understood this, and it built its nervous system out of women on bicycles, riding sometimes 60 or 70 miles in a day, town to town, message to message, carrying the war on their backs while appearing to carry nothing at all. The danger was constant and it was specific. A courier did not face the heroic danger of the battlefield, the danger that comes and is over. She faced the slow, grinding danger of the checkpoint, repeated day after day after day. There is a particular kind of courage required to walk a bicycle up to a barrier where two soldiers are checking papers, knowing that the false identity card in your hand was made last week in a back room and might not survive a careful look, knowing that the message in the bicycle frame would be a death sentence, and to keep your face arranged into the bored, mild expression of a woman who has done nothing wrong and has nowhere interesting to be. They learned to control their hands. They learned to control their breathing. Some of them learned to flirt a little, just enough to make the soldiers wave them through. They became actresses whose audience could kill them, performing the role of nobody in particular, every single day. What they carried mattered enormously. The réseaux of occupied France were the eyes of the Allied war effort on the continent. The railway worker who noted that a particular bridge over the Loire carried 3 German supply trains a night, that information, carried by a courier to a radio operator transmitted to London, could mean that bridge was bombed before a German offensive could be supplied. The position of a coastal gun battery, sketched by a fisherman and carried inland in a woman's coat lining, became a target. Money flowed the other way. London sent francs, parachuted in canisters, and the couriers distributed it, to pay the families who fed hidden airmen, to bribe a clerk for a blank ration card, to keep a forger in business. The whole thing ran on these silent, peddling women, and almost none of their names are known. But the secret war in France was not fought only in the towns and on the roads. There was another front, harder and more remote, and it lay in the hills. As the war ground on, and as the Germans, desperate for labor, began forcing young Frenchmen into compulsory work service in German factories, thousands of these men chose a different fate. Rather than report for the labor draft, they vanished into the forests of the Limousin, into the high pastures of the Verkers Plateau, into the scrubland of Provence that the locals called the maquis, the dense Mediterranean brush. The word attached itself to the men who hid there. They became the maquisards. And what began as simple evasion, young men hiding from a draft, slowly hardened into something else. An armed resistance living rough in the hills, fed by sympathetic farmers, organized by men who had been soldiers, waiting for the day they would be needed. Life in a maquis camp was not romantic. It was cold and it was hungry and it was tense. Imagine a clearing in a high forest, a dozen or 20 men, some of them barely out of school, a few of them hardened veterans of 1940. They have a handful of weapons, perhaps an old hunting rifle, a stolen German pistol, and if they are lucky, a Sten gun dropped by parachute. They sleep in shelters built from branches. They eat what the farmers below can spare and what they can poach from the woods. They post sentries through the night because a German patrol, or worse, a sweep by the milice, the French collaborationist paramilitary, the Frenchmen who hunted other Frenchmen, could come at any time. They are wanted men. Every farmer who feeds them risks his farm and his life. And they wait. They wait for the radio message from London, the personal message read out in the strange code of the BBC French service. The violin weeps a long sob. Jean has a long mustache. That would tell them their weapons were coming. Their moment was near. It was a war of waiting, and of nerves, and of trust extended to strangers in a world where trust could get you killed. Because the thing that the resistance feared most was not the German soldier. It was the informer. This is the part of the occupation that is hardest to convey, and it was the most corrosive. The Germans did not have enough men to police every village in France. They did not need to. They had something more effective. The knowledge that any neighbor might be watching, and the steady stream of denunciations that flowed into their offices from ordinary French people. Some informers did it for money. There were standing rewards for information leading to the arrest of resistors or hidden Jews or Allied airmen. Some did it out of conviction, true collaborators who believed in the new order. Some did it out of grudge, settling an old score with a neighbor by whispering a word to the right official. And some did it out of fear, hoping that by giving up someone else they might protect themselves. The effect of this was to poison the very air. A resistor could survive the Germans through caution and discipline. He could not always survive the man across the street who noticed that the lights in the supposedly empty house came on at night, who counted the loaves of bread the baker's wife carried up the hill, who wondered why a particular farm went through so much food. The whole edifice of the réseau rested on secrecy, and secrecy could be undone by a single human being deciding to talk. Every courier, every maquisard, every family hiding an airman lived with the knowledge that their fate might rest not on their own courage but on the silence of people they could not control. And in the summer of 1943, that fragility produced a catastrophe. The Prosper Network was the largest of the resistance organizations that British intelligence had built in occupied France. It was run, on the British side, by an officer of the Special Operations Executive, the secret organization Churchill had founded with the instruction to set Europe ablaze. And over the course of 1942 and 1943, it had spread across a vast region of northern and central France, organizing hundreds, eventually thousands, of resistors into circuits that received parachuted arms and prepared for the day of invasion. Prosper was, by the standards of the time, an enormous success. It was also built too large, too fast, with too many people knowing too much about one another. And that was its undoing. The collapse, when it came with terrifying speed. In June of 1943, the Germans began making arrests, and the arrests did not stop. One captured resistor led to another, and that one to another, the web of small ignorances that was supposed to contain the damage failing under the pressure of skilled and relentless interrogation. Within weeks, hundreds of people connected to the Prosper circuits were in German hands. The organizers were taken. The radio operators were taken. Arms caches, hidden in barns and quarries and the cellars of trusted houses, were dug up by the Germans, who seemed to know exactly where to look. The network that had taken more than a year to build was rolled up in a matter of weeks. The exact reason for the catastrophe has been argued about ever since, and the truth is tangled in the shadows where these things always live. Whether it was a captured agent who talked, whether a radio had been turned and was being played back to London by German hands, whether the whole thing had been compromised at a level that the people on the ground never suspected. What is not in doubt is the human cost. Hundreds of arrests, the arms that had been gathered for the liberation seized, and for the people taken, a journey that led into the German prison system, into the interrogation rooms, and for very many of them into the concentration camps in the East, from which most did not return. This was the brutal arithmetic of the secret war. A network built by hundreds of acts of quiet courage could be destroyed by a single point of failure, and the people who paid for that failure were the couriers and the safe housekeepers and the local farmers who had only ever known their one small corner of the web. They had protected themselves by knowing nothing. It did not save them. And yet, and this is the thing that has to be understood about the resistance in France, the collapse of one network did not end the war in the shadows. Could not. Because the resistance was not, finally, an organization that could be destroyed by destroying its structure. It was a decision made over and over by people who could not all be arrested at once. For every réseau that fell, the survivors regrouped, made contact with London again, began the slow, patient work of rebuilding. The couriers who escaped the net got back on their bicycles. New safe houses opened. The maquis in the hills grew, rather than shrank, as the occupation grew harsher and more young men fled to the forests. The Germans could win battles in this war. They could not win the war itself because they could not arrest a willingness, and the willingness was everywhere, distributed across a whole country, carried in the lining of 10,000 coats. The people who carried it paid a price that we are only beginning, even now, to reckon with. The courier who pedaled past the checkpoint with money for the airmen in the barn. She might do it 100 times, and the 101st time the soldier might decide, for no reason at all, to search the basket. The safe housekeeper might give shelter for a year and then answer a knock at the door at 3 in the morning. They lived inside a danger that never relented, and they kept going, and the remarkable thing is not that some of them were caught. The remarkable thing is how many of them, knowing exactly what awaited them if they were, chose to ride out anyway. And of all of them, it was the women who carried the heaviest and the least acknowledged burden. The young women on the bicycles. The women who memorized addresses and codes because paper could be found and a memory could not. The women who walked into the lion's mouth of the Avenue Foch and gave nothing away. The women who were sent into France from England, by parachute and by small black aircraft landing in moonlit fields, to do work so dangerous that the people who recruited them were told, quietly, that they should expect to lose half of them. History, when it bothered to remember the resistance at all, tended to remember the men in the hills with the guns. But the secret war was carried, mile after mile, message after message, on the backs of extraordinary women, and some of them were not French at all, but had crossed the channel in the dark, knowing the odds, carrying nothing but a false name and a thing that had to reach the man at the end of the road. It is to those women that we turn now. And so the men came in by parachute and by fishing boat, by forged papers and by the long slow walk across a border in the dark. But the resistance that received them, that hid them and fed them and moved their messages, was not only a movement of men. Could not have been. And the people who organized it in London understood this earlier, and more completely than almost anyone else who fought the war. The Special Operations Executive SOE, the secret British organization tasked by Churchill with, in his famous phrase, setting Europe ablaze, made a decision in the spring of 1942 that was, for its time and place, genuinely radical. It decided to send women into occupied France. Not as nurses, not as auxiliaries safely behind the lines, but as agents, couriers carrying messages and money across a country crawling with German security police, and wireless operators transmitting the signals that connected the resistance to London. They would be dropped by parachute or landed by small aircraft into fields lit by torches held by people they had never met, into a country where capture meant interrogation, and very often meant death. The reasoning was coldly practical, and it tells you something about the war that the practical reasoning happened to be correct. In occupied France, by 1942, a man of military age moving around the country attracted attention. Where were his papers? Why was he not working in a German labor program? Why was he traveling? A young woman with a shopping bag, riding a bicycle through a village or sitting in a railway carriage with a suitcase on her lap, drew no such suspicion. She could carry a wireless set past a checkpoint. She could deliver a message across a city. The very assumptions that had kept women out of every army in history, that they were not soldiers, not threats, not worth searching, became, in the secret war, an operational advantage. What it required of the women who accepted it was something that has no clean military name. A soldier in a uniform captured is a prisoner of war with rights under convention. A woman in civilian clothes carrying a radio was, in the eyes of the German security services, a spy. There was no protection. There was no exchange. There was only the long road that began with an arrest and led, very often, to a place from which no one returned. They knew this. They were told this, in the training houses in the English countryside, in language that left nothing to the imagination. And they went anyway. To understand what that took, you have to sit for a moment with one of them. And there is no one who illuminates the whole impossible enterprise more completely than a young woman who, by every conventional measure, should never have been a secret agent at all. Her name was Noor Inayat Khan. She had been born in Moscow in 1914, the daughter of an Indian Sufi mystic and an American mother, a descendant on her father's side of an 18th-century ruler of the Indian kingdom of Mysore. She had grown up partly in London and mostly in a quiet house outside Paris, in a household organized around her father's teaching of a gentle, universalist Sufism whose central principles were peace, harmony, and the refusal to do harm. She was a musician. She played the harp and the piano. She wrote children's stories. A collection of them, retellings of Buddhist fables, had been published in 1939. She was, by the account of everyone who knew her, dreamy, gentle, almost otherworldly, the kind of person you would least expect to find in the company of saboteurs and killers. When France fell in 1940, she fled with her family to England. And there, this gentle pacifist's daughter did something that the people who knew her struggled to understand. She joined the war. She enlisted in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force and trained as a wireless operator. And when SOE, desperate for radio operators who could pass as French, came looking, Noor had grown up speaking French in France. She was recruited. Her instructors at the training schools were divided about her, and their reports survive and they make uncomfortable reading. She was a brilliant wireless operator, fast and accurate on the Morse key. But some of them thought her temperamentally unsuited to the work. Too gentle, too honest, too easily frightened. A person who found it almost physically painful to lie. One report described her as not overburdened with brains. Another worried that she went to pieces when startled. The fundamental skill of the secret agent, the capacity to deceive, to maintain a false identity under pressure, to look a man in the eye and lie to him without a flicker, seemed to be exactly the thing she lacked. And yet the need was desperate. In June of 1943, Noor Inayat Khan was flown into occupied France by a small Lysander aircraft, landing in a field near Angers under a half-moon. She was the first woman SOE had ever sent into France as a wireless operator. Her code name was Madeline. She arrived into a catastrophe. Within weeks of her landing, the Paris resistance network she had been sent to join, a network called Prosper, was rolled up by the German security police in a wave of arrests that swept up agent after agent. Hundreds were taken. The network that was supposed to support her, to hide her, to give her safe houses and a structure to operate within, collapsed almost the moment she set foot in the country. London understood the scale of the disaster, and London offered her a way out. A message was sent. Come home. Get on a plane and come home while you still can. She refused. She refused because, with the network in ruins and every other radio operator arrested, she was now the only link left. She was the last wireless connection between the Paris resistance and London. If she left, the line went dead. And so this gentle young woman, the daughter of a man who had taught her never to harm a living thing, chose to remain in the most dangerous city in occupied Europe, carrying her heavy wireless set from safe house to safe house, transmitting under the noses of the German direction finding vans that crawled the streets of Paris listening for exactly the kind of signal she was sending. For 3.5 months she did the work of an entire network alone, the most wanted Allied radio operator in the city, moving constantly, changing addresses, knowing that the longer she stayed on the air the closer they came. What happened to her in the end came not from a mistake of her own, but from betrayal. She was sold to the German security police by someone within the resistance's own circle, for money. They came for her in October of 1943. And then this woman whose instructors had thought her too gentle, too frightened, too soft for the work, this woman astonished her captors. She fought them physically when they tried to take her. She gave them nothing. She attempted to escape from the building where they held her, climbing out onto the roof. Twice. The Germans came to regard her as so dangerous, so unbreakable, that they classified her as highly uncooperative and shipped her to Germany in chains. She was held in solitary confinement, her hands and feet shackled, for 10 months. And she never gave them what they wanted. Through interrogation, through deprivation, through everything they did to her, She did not betray her comrades. She did not break. In the autumn of 1944, she was taken to the Dachau concentration camp, and there, with 3 other women of SOE, she was killed. She was 30 years old. Survivors recalled that the last word she spoke was a single word called out, liberate. The instructors had been wrong about almost everything except her talent. The gentleness they mistook for weakness turned out to be the surface of something that did not yield. She was not alone in that. The women of SOE were a small group, a few dozen sent into France over the course of the war, and a terrible proportion of them did not come back. But to reduce them to that fact, to the price they paid, would be to do them the same disservice the world has so often done to forgotten soldiers, to remember the death and forget the person. So let us remember the people. Consider Violette Sabo. She was a Londoner, the daughter of an English father and a French mother, a shop girl who had worked the perfume counter at a department store before the war. She had married a French Foreign Legion officer named Etienne, who was killed at the Battle of El Alamein in North Africa, leaving her a widow with an infant daughter. It was grief, as much as anything, that brought her to SOE, a desire to strike back at the war that had taken her husband. She was an extraordinary shot, the best in her training class on the firing range. On her second mission into France in 1944, she was part of an effort to coordinate the resistance in the chaos following the D-Day landings. She was captured after a firefight, by one account, after holding off a German patrol with a submachine gun to let a comrade escape, firing until her ammunition was gone. She was 23. She did not come home. Her daughter, who had been a baby when her mother went to war, would later accept, on her behalf, the highest decoration Britain could give. Consider Andrée Borel, a French woman who had been in the fight from the very beginning. Before SOE recruited her, before England, she had already worked the escape lines in the south of France, guiding shot-down airmen and fugitives over the Pyrenees towards Spain and freedom. She was working class, practical, fearless, with no patience for pretense. When she parachuted back into the country she had already been fighting for in 1942, she became one of the first women SOE landed in France, the courier and second-in-command of a major Paris network, organizing, arming, holding the structure together. She was arrested in the same wave of betrayals that destroyed the Prosper network. She, too, did not come home. And consider Odette Sansom, who did. She was a French woman married to an Englishman, the mother of 3 young daughters, who left her children with friends to go into occupied France as a courier. She was captured, along with the network organizer she worked beside, a man she would later marry. She was interrogated with a brutality that is difficult to describe and will not be described here. They wanted the location of 2 other agents and the identity of a radio operator. She told them nothing. To protect herself and the man captured with her, she maintained a single lie under torture, that he was her husband and a relative of Churchill himself, a fabrication so audacious it may have kept them both alive, because the Germans calculated they might be valuable as hostages. She survived a concentration camp. She survived the war. She came home to her daughters. And she spent the rest of her long life insisting, to anyone who tried to make her a hero, that the real heroes were the ones who had not come back, that she had simply, by luck, lived. These were not soldiers in the way we usually mean the word. They had no rank that protected them, no convention that shielded them, no army at their back. They had a cover story, a set of forged papers, a few weeks of training, and the contents of their own character. And the war asked of them the hardest thing it ever asked of anyone, not to die in a moment of action, with the blood up and comrades beside them, but to walk knowingly, deliberately, day after day, through a country where a single wrong glance could end everything, carrying the kind of secrets that turned an arrest into something far worse than capture. Not all of them worked for the British, and not all of them fit the gentle image that words like courier might suggest. Some of them carried the war directly to the enemy, with a ferocity that startled the hardened men around them. And no one embodied that more than a woman the Gestapo came to fear under a code name they themselves gave her: the White Mouse. Her name was Nancy Wake. She was a New Zealander raised in Australia, a journalist by training, married to a wealthy French industrialist, and living a life of considerable comfort in Marseille when the war came. She could have sat it out in safety. Instead, she threw herself into the resistance from the earliest days, first running an escape line, helping Allied airmen and refugees slip out of France through Spain, using her money and her charm and her absolute nervelessness to move people the Germans were hunting. She was so effective and so maddeningly uncatchable that the Gestapo put an enormous price on her head and gave her the name by which she became legend, the White Mouse, because they could never trap her. When the net finally closed too tight around Marseille, she escaped over the Pyrenees herself, a brutal crossing on foot through the mountains in winter, and made it to England. Her husband, who stayed behind, was arrested by the Gestapo, tortured for information about her, and killed. He never told them where she was. She did not learn of his death until after the war, and she carried the knowledge that he had died protecting her for the rest of her life. In England, she joined SOE, and in 1944 she parachuted back into France, into the mountainous country of the Auvergne, to help arm and organize the resistance fighters gathering in the hills for the great rising that would come with the Allied invasion. There, among thousands of armed men, she was not a courier in the shadows. She was a leader, distributing weapons and money, organizing the fighters, leading raids, by one famous account riding a bicycle more than 100 miles through German-held territory and back over several days to replace a set of wireless codes that had been lost, because there was no one else who could do it, and the alternative was that the entire network would go silent. The men who fought alongside her, men who might have been expected to resent taking orders from a woman, instead came to regard her with something close to awe. She survived the war. She lived to be very old, into her 90s, and she remained, to the end, exactly what she had always been: blunt, fearless, entirely without sentimentality about what she had done. When people asked her how she had managed to do the things she did, she gave the kind of answer that the films never quite capture. She had simply, she said, decided that she was not going to be afraid. And whether or not that was the whole truth, it was clearly enough of the truth to carry her through a war that killed so many of the women who went in with her. What connects all of them, Nor and Violet, Andre and Odette, Nancy Wake, is not how they died, because some lived and some did not. What connects them is the nature of the choice they made. Each of them, at a specific moment, in a quiet room or on a cold airfield, with a parachute being strapped to her back, understood precisely what she was walking into. None of them was conscripted. None of them was swept up by the machinery of mobilization that put millions of men into uniform whether they willed it or not. Every one of them volunteered, knowing the price, and went in with her eyes open. And here we arrive at something worth pausing over, because it threads through everything in this part of the war and pulls us toward what comes next. The work these women did most often was not the dramatic work of sabotage and gunfire that the legend remembers. It was the patient, terrifying work of connection, carrying a message, moving a person, keeping a line open. The secret war was, at its heart, a war of lifelines, of fragile human chains stretched across a hostile continent, each link a person who could betray the rest, each crossing a small miracle of nerve. Noor Inayat Khan kept a radio line open. Nancy Wake, before she ever fired a shot in the Auvergne, ran an escape line out of Marseille. Andre Borel guided fugitives over the mountains before she ever wore a parachute. The work of moving people, getting them out, passing them hand to hand through a chain of strangers who risked everything to do it, runs underneath all of these stories like a buried cable. Because the enemy did not only have armies in the field, it had a continent under its control, and inside that continent were people who desperately needed to get out. Shot down Allied airmen, alive in occupied territory and worth their weight in gold to the war effort if they could be returned to fly again. Escaped prisoners of war. Resistance fighters with the Gestapo closing in. Jewish families fleeing for their lives from a machinery of murder that was grinding across Europe. All of them needed the same thing, a way through, a hidden path across a hostile land, from safe house to safe house, over mountains and across borders, run by ordinary people who would shelter a stranger one night and pass him to the next link in the chain the following dawn. These were the escape lines, and the men and women who built them, who ran them, who died maintaining them, performed one of the quietest and most extraordinary feats of the entire war. To follow one of those lines, to trace a single airman's journey from the moment his burning aircraft fell out of the sky to the moment he stepped, exhausted and disbelieving, onto neutral ground, is to understand how the war was fought not only by armies, but by farmers and schoolteachers and parish priests and teenage girls who chose, against every instinct of self-preservation, to open a door in the dark and say, "Come in." That is where we go next. down into the hidden geography of occupied Europe, the attics and cellars and mountain footpaths, and into the lives of the people who turned an entire continent into a network of escape. There is a particular sound that a downed airman remembers for the rest of his life, and it is not the sound of the crash. It is the silence afterward. The engine is gone, the wind is gone, the screaming of the air over the wings is gone, and what is left is a Belgian field at dawn, frost on the stubble, and the knowledge that he is alive in a country that belongs to the enemy and that there is, at this moment, no one in the world who knows where he is. He has a few words of schoolboy French. He has a silk escape map sewn into the lining of his flying jacket and a small compass disguised as a button. He has been told, in a briefing that now feels like it happened to someone else, that there are people in occupied Europe who will help him. He does not know who they are. He does not know how to find them. He only knows that if the wrong door opens first, he will spend the rest of the war behind wire, and the people who open the right door will be risking their lives to do it. The men who fell out of the sky over occupied Europe, and there were thousands of them, the crews of bombers shot down over Belgium and France and the Netherlands, the fighter pilots who bailed out over fields they could not name, entered a hidden world the moment they hit the ground. It was a world that existed nowhere on any map, that had no headquarters, no uniform, no flag. It was a network of ordinary people. A schoolteacher, a parish priest, a widow who ran a cafe, a Basque smuggler who knew the mountain paths, a teenage girl on a bicycle carrying forged papers in the basket under the bread. They called these networks the escape lines, and what they did was almost unbelievably simple to describe and almost unbelievably dangerous to perform. They took men who could not speak the language, who stood out in every crowd, who were hunted by the entire apparatus of the German occupation, and they passed them hand to hand, house to house, across hundreds of miles of enemy territory, all the way to the neutral border of Spain. And the price of being caught doing it was not prison. For the helpers, it was very often death. To understand how a network like this could exist at all, you have to start with a single person, and the most extraordinary of them was a young woman from Brussels named André de Jong. In the summer of 1941, she was 24 years old. She had trained as a commercial artist and then as a nurse, and she had spent her childhood idolizing Edith Cavell, the British nurse who had been shot by the Germans in Brussels in 1915 for helping Allied soldiers escape across the same border, in the previous war on the same ground. That detail is not incidental. André de Jong grew up on the story of a woman executed for exactly the thing she was about to do, and she did it anyway. When the Germans overran Belgium in 1940, she did not see a hopeless situation. She saw a problem with a solution, and the solution was a road south. What she proposed sounded, to the people she proposed it to, like the fantasy of a young woman who did not understand the danger. She would gather Allied soldiers and airmen stranded in Belgium, shelter them, equip them with false identity papers and personally escort them, by train, by foot, across occupied France, over the Pyrenees mountains and into Spain where the British consulate could repatriate them. She did not intend to send them. She intended to take them, herself. In August of 1941, she walked into the British consulate in the Spanish city of Bilbao, having just crossed the Pyrenees on foot, and presented the British officials with a Scottish soldier and 2 Belgian volunteers she had personally guided the entire way from Brussels. The British were, by every account, stunned and deeply suspicious. A young woman appears out of the mountains, claims to have built an escape route across the whole of occupied Western Europe, and asks for money to keep doing it. It had to be a German trap. Took them weeks to believe her. When they finally did, they gave the line a name. The British called it the Comet Line, and they gave André de Jong a code name. They called her Didi, and they asked cautiously whether she could really do it again. She did it again, and again. Over the next year and a half, she personally crossed the Pyrenees more than 30 times. The mechanics of the Comet Line were a marvel of careful, terrified precision. An airman would come down somewhere in Belgium or northern France. A local, a farmer, a resistance contact, a member of the line's collection network, would reach him before the Germans did, hide him, and pass word up the chain. The man would be moved to a safe house in Brussels, where he would be questioned closely. This interrogation was not hostility. It was survival. The Germans had learned to insert their own agents into the escape lines, fluent English speakers in stolen flying jackets carrying memorized cover stories. Men whose entire purpose was to be passed down the line so they could memorize the faces and the addresses and then deliver the whole network to the Gestapo in a single night. So the helpers asked questions only a real British or American airman could answer. What is the name of a famous footballer? What does a particular coin look like? What is the song everyone in your country knows? A wrong answer or an answer given too smoothly, and the man would simply disappear from the line, because the people running it could not afford to gamble the lives of dozens of helpers on one stranger's story. Once a man was accepted, the line dressed him as a civilian, photographed him, and produced false identity documents, work permits, identity cards, travel passes, all forged by hand or stolen and altered, all of them good enough to survive a glance from a German checkpoint guard but never good enough to survive a serious examination. The men were drilled in how to behave. Do not put your hands in your pockets the way an Englishman does. Do not look left first when you cross the street. Do not react when someone speaks to you in German. Do not respond when someone says your real name to test you. Above all, do not speak. The single greatest danger an escaping airman posed to the people saving him was his own mouth. So they were told to pretend to be deaf or simple or asleep. On the trains south through France, a young Belgian or French guide would sit beside the airman, talk to him as though they were friends, do all the talking for both of them, and pray that no German would address the silent man by the window directly. And then came the mountains. The Pyrenees crossing was the part of the journey that nearly broke even men who had survived being shot down. The line used the western end of the range, near the Bay of Biscay, where the mountains run down toward the Atlantic, and it used Basque guides, smugglers who had been walking these paths for generations, men who knew which valleys to follow and which ridges to avoid and where the German and Spanish patrols would be. The most famous of them was a man named Florentino Goicoechea, a Basque smuggler of enormous strength and almost no education who could not read a map but who could find his way across those mountains in total darkness, in driving rain, drunk on the brandy he carried to keep out the cold. Florentino guided hundreds of men over the Pyrenees and was never, in all those crossings, captured leading a party across. They went at night. They went in winter as well as summer because the war did not stop for the weather. The airmen, soft from months of barracks life and weeks of hiding indoors, wearing borrowed shoes that did not fit, were expected to climb and descend for 10, 12, 14 hours over terrain that mountain shepherds respected. They crossed icy rivers, sometimes roped together, sometimes wading through water so cold it stopped the breath. Men slipped. Men fell. There is a documented night when a crossing met the Bidasoa River in flood, and André de Jong herself, small and exhausted, helped haul the men across in the dark with the water dragging at them, and they made it, all of them, because the alternative to making it was unthinkable. The airmen who survived the crossing wrote about it for the rest of their lives with a kind of awe, not at their own endurance but at the calm of the young guides, often half their size, who had done this a dozen times and would turn around at the Spanish border and walk all the way back into occupied France to do it again. But every story of this kind carries a shadow, and the shadow over the escape lines was betrayal. A network built entirely on trust, stretched across hundreds of miles and dozens of households, was only ever as strong as its weakest, most frightened, or most compromised link. And the Germans understood this perfectly. They did not need to find the whole line. They needed to find one thread and pull. In January of 1943, after 18 months and more than 150 men brought safely to Spain, André de Jong was at a farmhouse at Arugn, near the foot of the Pyrenees, waiting out bad weather with a group of airmen before the final crossing. The Germans came. The line had been penetrated, betrayed, the evidence suggests, by an informer who had wormed his way into the network. She was arrested. And here the story turns on a detail that is almost unbearable in its irony. André de Jong, under interrogation, told the Gestapo the truth. That she, a young woman, was the founder and the leader of the Comet Line, that she had personally organized the whole thing, that she had crossed the mountains dozens of times. The Germans did not believe her. They could not accept that the architect of a network that had humiliated them for 2 years was a slight young woman in her 20s. And that disbelief, more than anything else, is what kept her alive. She was sent to the Ravensbrück and Mauthausen concentration camps. She survived them. She was liberated in 1945. Her father, Frederick de Jong, who had taken over running the Paris end of the line after she went south, was not so fortunate. He was arrested, and in March of 1944 he was shot. The arrest of Didi did not kill the Comet Line. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about these networks, and the thing that most enraged the Germans. They were designed so that no single person knew the whole of it. When André de Jong was taken, others stepped into the gap, and the line kept running, kept moving men south until the liberation. By the war's end, the Comet Line had delivered well over 700 Allied servicemen back to Britain to fight again. But it had cost the lives of an estimated 150 of its helpers. The school teachers and priests and cafe owners and farmers, the ordinary Belgians and French who had opened the right door. For every airman who made it home with a story of incredible kindness from strangers, there was, somewhere behind him, a family that paid for that kindness in a prison cell or against a wall. The Comet Line was not alone. To the south, running men from the south of France across the eastern Pyrenees and out through Marseille, was a network the British called the Pat O'Leary Line. Its leader carried one of the great cover identities of the war. He called himself Patrick Albert O'Leary and claimed to be a French-Canadian airman, and almost no one in the line knew that this man was in fact a Belgian army doctor named Albert Marie Gaurice. Gaurice had been a cavalry officer, had escaped to England after the fall of Belgium, and had taken his cover name to protect his family back home from reprisal. Under the name O'Leary, he built and ran one of the most effective escape organizations in occupied France, moving downed airmen and escaped prisoners of war south towards Spain and out by boat across the Mediterranean. The O'Leary Line did something the Comet Line, for the most part, did not. It integrated escaped prisoners of war on a large scale, including men who had broken out of camps and walked across France. And it relied, like all the lines, on a few extraordinary and largely forgotten individuals. There was a Scottish soldier named Donald Caskey, a minister who ran the Seamen's Mission in Marseille and used it as a clearinghouse for escaping men, hiding them among the sailors, feeding them, moving them on. There was Nancy Wake, later famous as a resistance fighter in her own right, who in these early years worked as a courier for the O'Leary Line, riding trains across France with money and messages, her cheerful manner and her papers getting her through checkpoints that would have stopped a more nervous traveler. The line ran for years, and it ran on the same fragile, beautiful, terrifying principle as all the others. That enough ordinary people in enough ordinary houses would choose to take a stranger in. And it died, in the end, the same way. The Germans found their thread. A man was recruited into the line who was, in fact, working for the enemy, a traitor whose name became infamous in the histories of the escape networks. In March of 1943, Albert Gaurice, the man the world knew as Pat O'Leary, was arrested. Like Didi, he survived the camps. Like Didi, many of those he had worked with did not. The line that bore his invented name had moved hundreds of men to freedom before it fell. There is a question that hangs over all of this, and it is worth asking plainly, because the people who lived it asked it of themselves. Why did they do it? The helpers gained nothing. They were not soldiers. Most of them would have been left entirely alone by the Germans if they had simply kept their doors shut and their heads down. The man hiding in the attic was usually a foreigner they had never met and would never see again, who could not even thank them in a language they understood. And the penalty for being caught was the destruction of everything, themselves, often their husbands and wives, sometimes their children. They knew all of this. The Germans made sure they knew it, posting the names of executed helpers, raiding villages, making examples. And they did it anyway in their thousands across every occupied country, for 4 years. When the airmen who survived tried, decades later, to explain what had happened to them, this was always the part they could not get past. Not the danger of the crossing, not the cold of the mountains, but the inexplicable, unpurchasable decency of the people who had sheltered them. A farmer's wife who gave up her own bed. A family who sat a strange silent man down at their table and fed him from rations they barely had, knowing the soldier could mean a death sentence for all of them. A teenage girl who cycled past German guards with a fugitive's photograph and forged papers hidden in her basket, smiling, because a frightened face is a face that gets searched. These were not professional agents. They were people who decided, one stranger at a time, that there was a line they would not let the occupation cross inside themselves, and they held it at the cost of their lives. That instinct, the refusal to simply accept the occupation as the new shape of the world, did not stop at the front door of a safe house. The same networks that learned to move a man across a country in secret, that learned to forge a document and read a checkpoint and trust a stranger and survive a betrayal, were learning something else at the same time. They were learning the geography of the occupier's power. They knew which rail lines carried German troops south and which carried supplies east. They knew where the depots were, where the telephone lines ran, where the bridges crossed the rivers. And as the war ground on and the prospect of liberation turned from a prayer into a plan, a colder and more deliberate idea began to take hold in the resistance. It was no longer enough to save the men the Germans had shot down. The same hands that had passed an airman quietly from house to house in the dark could just as quietly place a charge against a railway line, jam a factory machine, derail a train carrying tanks to the front. The instinct to protect was about to become the instinct to destroy. Not the enemy's soldiers, but the machine that moved them, the steel and rails and engines that the German war effort could not function without. The hidden world was about to pick up tools. There is a particular kind of silence that follows a successful act of sabotage, and the men who performed it learned to recognize it the way a hunter recognizes the stillness of a wood after a shot. It is not the silence of nothing happening. It is the silence of a machine that should be running and is not. In a small arms components factory outside Lyon, in the autumn of 1943, a French toolmaker named Marcel Reynaud stood at his lathe for the 11th straight hour and listened to that silence settle over the shop floor. The great milling machine 3 stations down from him had stopped. It had stopped because, 2 nights earlier, Reynaud had taken a fine steel file and, over the course of perhaps 40 seconds while the German foreman was at the far end of the building, removed a precise amount of metal from a single bearing housing. Not enough to be visible, not enough to be felt by a hand running across it, but enough that under load, at speed, over hours, the bearing would heat and seize and destroy itself and take 3 days and a part that did not exist anywhere in occupied France to replace. Reynaud did not blow anything up. He did not fire a shot. He removed a few grams of steel, and a machine that made firing pins for German rifles went dark for the better part of a week. And here is the thing that the planners in London were beginning to understand, the insight that would reshape the entire secret war in the months before the invasion. Marcel Reynaud, with a file in 40 seconds, had done something that a flight of bombers could not reliably do at all. To bomb that factory, the Royal Air Force would have to send dozens of aircraft hundreds of miles through defended airspace. They would lose some of those aircraft and the crews inside them. They would, with the bombing accuracy of 1943, miss the factory more often than they hit it, and when they hit it they would also hit the French houses around it and kill the French families inside. They would crater the building and the Germans would clear the rubble and rebuild, and 3 months later the factory would be running again, and the French town would hate the British a little more than it hated the Germans. That was the cost of doing it from the air. Marcel Reynaud did it from the inside, for the price of a file, and nobody died and nobody knew. This was the logic that animated the war on the rails and in the factories. It was not glamorous. It produced no headlines, no newsreel footage, no medals pinned on chests in front of cameras. It was, in the most literal sense, invisible work. But by 1943 the men running the Special Operations Executive and the French resistance had come to understand that a war fought from inside the enemy's own machinery was, ton for ton and life for life, the most efficient form of warfare available to them. And they began to systematize it. The principle had a name, drawn from a famous piece of guidance that circulated through the networks. Industrial sabotage should be precise, not destructive. Do not burn the factory. The factory is hard to burn and easy to rebuild. Find the one machine, the one part, the one bottleneck that the entire process depends upon and stop that. A locomotive is enormously expensive and very difficult to destroy with explosives. But a locomotive cannot run without certain bearings, and those bearings, drained of oil and run hot, will destroy themselves and the engine around them, and leave no evidence of anything but bad luck and poor German maintenance. Sand in an axle box, carborundum paste, an abrasive grinding compound, smeared into a lubrication line, acid in a transformer, a few turns of a wrench in the dark on the right bolt. The men who did this work understood that their greatest protection was that it should never look like sabotage at all. A blown bridge announces itself. A locomotive that simply fails again and again on the same line looks like the ordinary friction of a war machine wearing out, until the failures cluster, and the Germans begin to understand that they are not wearing out. They are being killed quietly from the inside. But the rails were where the war was truly decided, and to understand why, you have to understand what a railway was to the German army in occupied Europe. The Wehrmacht did not move on roads. The romantic image of the war is of columns of tanks and trucks rolling across the countryside, and that image is true for the final miles of any operation. But the German war machine, like every great army before and since, lived and died by rail. A division, 15,000 men, their guns, their vehicles, their fuel, their ammunition, the staggering tonnage of supply that kept them in the field, moved across the continent on trains. To send a single armored division from the Eastern Front to Normandy was not a road march. It was dozens upon dozens of trains, each one a vulnerable steel snake creeping across hundreds of miles of track that ran, every yard of it, through countries that hated the men riding on it. And that track was almost impossible to defend. A bridge can be guarded. A station can be garrisoned. But the open line, the thousands of miles of rail running through forests and cuttings and along embankments and over countless small culverts and switches, could not be watched along its whole length by any number of soldiers the Germans could spare. Every meter of it was a place where, in the dark, a man with a small charge and 10 minutes could turn a smooth steel rail into a twisted obstacle, and turn a train carrying tanks toward the invasion front into a derailed, burning, blocking wreck. The resistance learned the geometry of this with a kind of grim mathematics. The most valuable place to cut a line was not in the open, where the track could be quickly relayed. It was in a cutting, a place where the railway ran in a deep trench gouged through a hill, with steep walls of earth on either side. Derail a heavy locomotive in a cutting and you did not merely break the train. You wedged 100 tons of dead iron into a narrow defile where no crane could reach it, where clearing it meant days of work, and where the line behind it backed up with every other train waiting to pass. One charge, well placed, could close a vital artery not for hours but for days. And the men who placed it would be 3 valleys away before the Germans arrived to find the wreckage and the empty cutting and the cold place in the grass where the charge had been laid. There is a particular image that recurs in the testimony of these saboteurs, and it has a terrible beauty to it. The locomotive on its side in the bottom of a wooded cutting at dawn, the great driving wheels still slowly turning in the air, the steam still hissing white from the ruptured boiler, the spilled coal black against the embankment, and all around it the absolute quiet of the forest, the birds beginning again now that the noise had stopped. The men who made that happen were rarely there to see it. They placed the charge in the small hours, walked away into the trees, and read about their work in the cautious, coded reports that came back up the line. But they knew what it looked like. They had all seen at least one. The technique itself was an education in patience and nerve. To derail a train you did not simply lay a charge on the rail and run. You had to understand the timing of the line, which trains ran when, which were worth taking and which were not, how long the German trackwalkers took to patrol a section, how much moon there would be. You worked at night, often in pairs, one man laying the charge while the other lay in the grass of the embankment watching the line in both directions. The charge had to be fixed to the rail itself, on the outer edge of a curve where the derailing force would throw the locomotive off the embankment rather than simply stopping it. The detonation was timed to the locomotive. You wanted to kill the engine first so the dead weight of it would drag the cars behind into ruin. And then you wanted to be gone. Always, you wanted to be gone before the white flash lit the cutting, because the flash would be seen, and within the hour there would be Germans on the line and dogs in the trees and roadblocks on every lane. It was a war of leaving. The saboteur's true skill was not the explosive. It was the disappearance. And the Germans hated it with a special intensity, because they could not get hold of it. An army wants an enemy it can find and fight. The resistance gave them an enemy that struck in the dark and dissolved into a population that looked exactly like every other Frenchman in every other village. So the Germans did what occupying armies do when they cannot find the men who are killing them. They reached for the population around the act. After a derailment, they would seize hostages from the nearest town and shoot them. They would post notices warning that for every act of sabotage, a number of citizens would die. They imagined this would deter the resistance. Sometimes it did. More often it did the opposite. It took men and women who had been bystanders and turned them into the resistance, because once the Germans had shot your neighbors for something you did not do, there was very little left to lose by doing it yourself. This was the cat-and-mouse game that ran underneath the whole occupation, and it had no front line and no rules and very little mercy. The Germans developed countermeasures. They ran empty pilot trains ahead of the important ones to trip any charges. They bolted observation cars to the front of locomotives. They walked the lines obsessively. They planted informers in every town and paid well for whispers. The resistance adapted in turn. They learned to set delayed charges that let the pilot train pass. They learned to attack not the trains but the things the trains depended on, the water towers without which a steam locomotive cannot run, the signal boxes, the turntables in the depots the great cranes used to clear wrecks. There was a particular elegance in destroying the German wreck-clearing equipment, because then every subsequent derailment took twice as long to clear. You did not just cut the artery. You cut the body's ability to heal. And all the while, behind this nightly war of files and charges and disappearances, something larger was being assembled. Because the men in London were not thinking only about slowing the German war machine in 1943. They were thinking about a single day in the future, a day they could not yet name but knew was coming, when Allied armies would come ashore somewhere on the coast of France and would spend the most dangerous hours of the entire war clinging to a few miles of beach, desperately trying to build up faster than the Germans could counterattack. On that day, everything would depend on speed. Not the speed of the men coming ashore. They would move at the pace of frightened soldiers under fire, which is to say slowly. The speed that mattered was the speed of the German reinforcements. The Germans had divisions, armored divisions, the kind of force that could throw a landing back into the sea, stationed across France and beyond. The only question that mattered on the day of the invasion was this. Could the Germans get those divisions to the beaches faster than the Allies could land enough men to hold them? And how would those German divisions travel? By rail. This was the insight around which the entire secret war on the railways was eventually organized, and it was given a name that sounded like nothing at all: Plan Vert. The Green Plan. It was a thing of almost obsessive detail, a master scheme that identified, across the entire French railway network, the specific points whose destruction would do the most damage to German movement. Not random sabotage. Surgical, coordinated, simultaneous paralysis. Every bridge, every cutting, every junction, every roundhouse and signal complex was catalogued and assigned. The resistance teams that would attack each one were identified and trained and supplied. And the entire plan was held in abeyance, like a drawn bowstring, waiting for a single signal that would be broadcast over the airwaves when the invasion began. A coded phrase, hidden among the ordinary messages, that would tell hundreds of scattered teams across France that the hour had come and that tonight, all at once, the railways of France were to be cut. The idea was breathtaking in its ambition. The German army's ability to reinforce the invasion front would not be slowed by one derailment or 10. It would be slowed by hundreds, all in the same night, across every line leading to the coast, so that a journey that should take 2 days would take 2 weeks, and the armored divisions racing to throw the Allies back into the sea would instead sit stalled in sidings, blocked by wreckage they could not clear, hunted from the air whenever they tried to move by road instead. Every hour those divisions were delayed was an hour the men on the beach would have to dig in, to land more men, to turn a toehold into a foothold into a front. The saboteurs with their files and their charges were not, it turned out, fighting a separate little war of their own. They were the first move in the largest battle of the war, and they would make it before a single Allied soldier set foot on the sand. It was a magnificent plan, and it was, almost everywhere, a war of patience and precision and the quiet, unglamorous courage of ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the dark. But there was one mission in the far frozen north that was none of those things, or rather, that was all of those things and something else as well, something that lifted it out of the ordinary register of sabotage entirely and made it perhaps the single most important act of destruction of the entire war. Because the men running the secret war had learned, from sources they could barely believe, that the Germans were building something. Not a factory, not a bridge, not a railway. Something far stranger and far more dangerous. In a remote valley in occupied Norway, walled in by mountains and ice, sat a single industrial plant that was producing a substance most of the men fighting the war had never heard of and could not have explained. A substance that looked exactly like ordinary water, that you could pour from a glass and drink without knowing the difference, and that, in the hands of German physicists, might unlock a weapon against which no resistance, no sabotage, no army on earth would matter at all. It was called heavy water. And in the winter mountains of Norway, a handful of men were about to be asked to do something that the planners themselves were not sure could be done: to climb into the most ferocious terrain in Europe, in the dead of winter, and destroy it. There is a plateau in the south of Norway called the Hardangervidda, and in winter it is one of the most hostile inhabited places in Europe. It sits 1,000 meters above the sea, a treeless expanse of frozen marsh and wind-scoured rock that stretches for thousands of square kilometers. And in the dark months the temperature falls past -30 and the wind comes off the North Atlantic carrying snow that does not fall so much as travel sideways, parallel to the ground, until it has erased every landmark and every track and every trace that a human being was ever there. There are no roads. There are no trees to break the wind. There is only white in every direction, under a sky that in December gives perhaps 4 hours of gray half-light before the dark returns. On the 18th of October, 1942, 4 men parachuted onto that plateau in the middle of the night. They were Norwegians, all of them, young men who had escaped their occupied country and trained in Britain and volunteered to come back. Their code name was Grouse. Their orders were to land on the Hardangervidda, survive there, and wait, to establish themselves on the frozen plateau and prepare the ground for a force that would follow. A force that had been assigned the single most important sabotage mission the Allies would attempt in the entire war in Western Europe. The thing they had come to destroy was 800 kilometers of physics. It was a problem in nuclear chemistry, and it sat in a valley below them, in a hydroelectric plant clinging to the side of a gorge so deep and so steep that the Germans believed no human being could approach it. To understand why 4 men were freezing on a plateau in October of 1942, you have to understand what was in that plant. And to understand that, you have to understand a word that almost no one in the world had heard of: heavy water. Water, ordinary water, is made of hydrogen and oxygen. But a tiny fraction of all hydrogen in the world is a slightly heavier version of the same element, an atom called deuterium, identical in chemistry but carrying a little extra mass in its nucleus. Water made with deuterium instead of ordinary hydrogen looks exactly like normal water, tastes like normal water, freezes and boils at almost the same temperatures. It is heavier very slightly, and it has one property that, in the early 1940s, made it one of the most strategically valuable substances on Earth. It can slow down neutrons without absorbing them. In the language of the physicists working in secret on both sides of the war, it was a moderator. It was one of the few materials in the world that could make a nuclear chain reaction sustain itself. It was potentially a path to an atomic bomb. And there was only one industrial facility on the planet producing it in quantity. It was called Vemork, a hydroelectric and chemical plant in the Norwegian region of Telemark, owned by the company Norsk Hydro. It produced heavy water as a byproduct of fertilizer manufacturing, in tiny concentrations, drop by drop, in a process that consumed enormous amounts of electricity. And in 1940, when the Germans occupied Norway, they took control of it, and then they ordered production increased. In London, the men who understood what that meant did not sleep well. They did not know how far the German nuclear program had advanced. They could not know. But they knew that the only large-scale source of heavy water in the world was now in German hands, and that the Germans were demanding more of it, and that the purpose of more of it could only be one thing. The plant had to be stopped. Not damaged, stopped. The heavy water production at Vemork had to be destroyed in a way that could not quickly be repaired. The men of Grouse landed to prepare the way. And almost immediately the plateau began to kill them. They had been dropped in the wrong place, several kilometers from their intended landing zone, and they spent days hauling their equipment across the frozen wilderness on improvised sledges, sinking to their thighs in snow, their loads weighing more than the men themselves. The food they had brought ran low and then ran out. They had planned to live partly off the land, but the Hardangervidda in winter offers almost nothing. A few reindeer, if you are lucky and can shoot one, and almost nothing else. The 4 men of Grouse came close to starvation. One of them, Claus Hellberg, would later describe chewing on reindeer moss scraped from beneath the snow, the same lichen the reindeer themselves survived on, boiling it into a bitter paste that the human stomach can barely process. They grew weak, they grew thin, and they sent their radio reports to London, and they waited for the force that was coming to do the actual work. That force was called Operation Freshman, and it was a catastrophe. The plan was to fly in British combat engineers, commandos, men of the Royal Engineers, the most highly trained sabotage troops Britain could field. They would come not by parachute but by glider. 2 large gliders, each towed behind a bomber, released over Norway to land silently on the frozen plateau, where the men of Grouse would guide them in toward the target. It was an ambitious plan. Gliders had never been used in conditions like these, over mountains in winter, at the limit of the towing aircraft's range. navigating to a landing zone marked only by a radio beacon and a few lights held by starving men on a plateau the size of a small country. On the night of the 19th of November, 1942, two bombers took off from Scotland, each towing a glider full of engineers, and flew east across the North Sea toward Norway. Almost everything that could go wrong went wrong. The weather over the target was terrible. Cloud, ice forming on the wings and the tow ropes, navigation equipment failing in the freezing air. One bomber could not find the landing zone and turned back, and over the mountains the ice and the strain became too much, and the tow rope to its glider snapped. The glider, suddenly cut loose with no engine, full of men, went down into the Norwegian mountains. The second bomber crashed into a mountainside, killing everyone aboard, and its glider crashed as well. In the space of a single night, both gliders were down, somewhere in the wilderness of occupied Norway, and the men inside them, those who survived the crashes, were scattered, injured, freezing, and entirely alone in enemy territory. What happened to the survivors is one of the darkest chapters of the entire campaign. Some of the engineers died in the crashes. Those who lived through the impact, injured and bleeding in the snow, were hunted down and captured by German forces. And here the story passes from the realm of war into the realm of murder. Hitler had issued that same year the Commando Order, a secret directive stating that Allied commandos captured behind German lines were to be executed, regardless of whether they were in uniform, regardless of whether they surrendered. The surviving engineers of Operation Freshman, men who had given themselves up as prisoners of war, were interrogated, and then they were killed. Some were shot, some were poisoned. They were buried in unmarked graves, or thrown into the sea. Not one of the men who flew out that night on Operation Freshman ever came home. And the heavy water plant at Vemork was untouched. The Germans now knew, beyond any doubt, that the Allies were trying to reach it. They reinforced the garrison. They laid mines. They strung wire. They put searchlights on the gorge. The single most important sabotage target in occupied Europe was now on the highest alert, and the 4 men of Grouse, renamed now to Swallow, still starving on the plateau above, had watched the rescue they were waiting for die in the mountains around them. London had to decide whether to try again. And the men who made that decision understood something that the failure of Freshman had made brutally clear. Gliders full of British engineers could not reach Vemork. The only men who could survive the Hardangervidda, who could move across it and live on it and approach the plant through terrain the Germans considered impassable, were Norwegians. Men who had grown up on skis. Men who knew the cold the way a sailor knows the sea. So they assembled a second team. 6 more Norwegians, all volunteers, all of them men who had escaped the occupation and trained in Scotland for exactly this. Their leader was a young man named Joachim Ronneberg, 23 years old, calm to the point of seeming unhurried, a natural commander who chose his own men and trained them himself. The operation was named Gunnerside. And on the night of the 16th of February, 1943, they parachuted onto the Hardangervidda to join the starving survivors of Grouse and finish what Freshman had failed to begin. They did not land near their comrades. They landed, like Grouse before them, in the wrong place into a storm, a full Norwegian winter blizzard that pinned them in their sleeping bags inside a hunting hut for days, unable to move, unable to see, the wind screaming across the plateau outside. When the storm finally broke, they began to search for the men of Grouse across a frozen wilderness with no landmarks, navigating by dead reckoning and luck. The meeting of the two groups, when it finally came, was almost accidental. Figures sighted across the snow, weapons raised, recognition. The Grouse men were skeletal, ragged, half-starved, but alive. Now there were 9 of them, and below, in the gorge, waited the plant. The approach to Vemork was the part the Germans believed could not be done. The plant sat on a shelf of rock on one side of a deep ravine, a gorge perhaps 200 meters deep, with a river at the bottom. There was a suspension bridge across the gorge, guarded, mined, watched. The Germans had concentrated their defenses on that bridge because the bridge was the only sane way to approach. The other way, down one icy cliff face, across the frozen river at the bottom, and up the other side toward the plant, was not, in the German assessment, a route a human being would attempt in winter. Which is precisely why Ronneberg chose it. On the night of the 27th of February, 1943, the 9 men descended into the gorge. They went down the cliff in the dark, finding handholds in the ice and the rock, the river roaring below them, the cold so deep that bare skin froze to metal. They reached the bottom. The river was partly frozen, partly open and freezing, and they crossed it. And then they climbed the far side, up toward the rail line that ran into the plant. A route the Germans had not bothered to guard because no one comes that way. They followed the railway tracks toward the building, white against the snow in their camouflage suits, and they reached the fence. They were divided into two parties. A covering party to deal with the guards if the alarm was raised, and a demolition party of just a few men, who would actually enter the plant and set the charges. Ronneberg led the demolition party himself. They found a cable duct, a narrow passage carrying pipes and wiring into the basement of the plant, where the heavy water electrolysis cells stood in their long rows. They crawled through it, one man at a time, into the cellar of the most important industrial facility in occupied Europe, while above them a German garrison slept. Inside the cellar, in the dim light, was the target itself. The high-concentration electrolysis cells, 18 of them, where the heavy water was refined drop by precious drop. Ronneberg and his men had trained on a wooden mock-up of these exact cells, built in Britain from intelligence supplied by a Norwegian engineer who had worked in the plant. They knew the shape of the charges to lay. They worked quickly in the half-dark, laying the explosive charges against the cells, the fuses connected, their hands steady. There was a single Norwegian watchman in the room, a civilian employee who was unarmed and who, when he understood who these men were and what they were doing, helped them, at one point asking only that they let him retrieve his spectacles, which were irreplaceable in occupied Norway, before they blew the room apart. They let him get his glasses. Ronneberg shortened the fuses. He had intended to use long fuses to give the men time to escape, but standing in that cellar he made a decision. He cut the fuses short to 30 seconds, to be certain the charges could not be discovered and removed before they detonated. 30 seconds was barely enough time to get clear. He lit them. The men ran. The explosion, when it came, was almost an anticlimax. A muffled thud, contained by the thick walls and the deep cellar, so quiet that the German sentry standing guard outside walked over to investigate, found nothing obvious amiss and went back to his post. But in the cellar, the 18 electrolysis cells were destroyed, and with them the accumulated heavy water of months of production poured out across the floor and into the drains and was gone. Not one of the saboteurs fired a shot. Not one of them was hurt. They had crippled the German heavy water program, and the garrison did not even know it had happened until the men were already climbing back down into the gorge. What followed was an escape across one of the largest manhunts of the war. The Germans, when they discovered the sabotage, flooded the region with thousands of troops, and the 9 men of Gunnerside and Grouse vanished into the Hardangervidda. Some of them skied across the plateau and over the mountains and across the border into neutral Sweden, a journey of some 400 kilometers on skis, through the deep winter ahead of the pursuit. Ronneberg's party made it. Others stayed behind in Norway to continue the resistance. Claus Hellberg, one of the original Grouse men, was spotted by a German patrol and skied away from them across the open plateau. A running gunfight on skis, and when his pursuer finally cornered him, the 2 men exchanged fire across the snow until the German ran out of ammunition. Hellberg, wounded, his arm broken in a subsequent fall down a cliff, made his way to a hotel where, in an irony almost too perfect to be true, he found himself sharing the building with a high-ranking visiting German official, and talked his way to safety with a broken arm and a false identity. He survived the war, but the heavy water came back. This was the cruelty of it. The plant was sabotaged, yes, but the Germans repaired it within months and production resumed. The Allies bombed it from the air later that year, hundreds of American bombers over the gorge, killing Norwegian civilians and damaging the plant but not stopping it. And so the Germans made a decision. They would abandon the heavy water production at Vemork and ship the entire stock they had accumulated, every drop of it, the concentrated product of years of work, back to Germany. And that set the stage for the last act and the hardest one, because the heavy water would have to travel by rail to the coast, and to do that it would have to cross a lake, Lake Tinn, on a ferry. And a young Norwegian resistance fighter named Knut Haukelid, one of the men who had stayed behind after Gunnerside, was given the order to make sure it never reached Germany. The order tormented him because the ferry, the SF Hydro, would be full of ordinary Norwegian civilians. Passengers, neighbors, people going about their lives, who knew nothing of the cargo in the freight cars. To sink the ferry was to kill them. Herold weighed it the way only a man given an impossible order can weigh it, the certainty of innocent deaths now against the uncertainty of what the heavy water might do if it reached Germany. He chose to sink the ferry. He calculated where in the lake the water was deepest, so that the cargo could never be salvaged, and he timed the charge for the middle of the crossing, over the deepest water, to be sure. In the early hours of the 20th of February, 1944, Herold and a small team went aboard the ferry as it lay at the dock, slipped down into the bilge below the waterline, and laid a charge against the hull, wired to a timer made from an alarm clock, set to detonate when the ferry reached the deepest part of the lake. They left. The ferry sailed on schedule the next morning, loaded with the heavy water and crowded with passengers. At the deepest point of Lake Tin, the charge went off. The bow of the SF Hydro lifted and then dropped, and the ferry went down in minutes into water hundreds of meters deep. 14 Norwegian civilians died with it, along with several Germans. And the heavy water, the entire accumulated stock of the German atomic program, sank to the bottom of a Norwegian lake, beyond any hope of recovery, where most of it remains to this day. It is a story without a clean ending, which is why it is true. Men died on the plateau and in the gliders and in the cellars of the Gestapo. Civilians died on a ferry on a quiet morning. And whether the German bomb was ever truly close, historians still argue this, and the German program was further from a weapon than the Allies feared, does not change what those men believed they were doing, or what they were willing to spend to do it. They skied across a frozen wilderness that should have killed them, descended a gorge the enemy thought impassable, and stopped, with a few kilograms of explosive and an enormous quantity of courage, what they had been told might decide the war. The Hardangervidda kept its silence after they were gone. The wind came back across the plateau and erased their tracks, as it erases everything, and the white closed over the place where they had been. But the secret war did not belong only to the frozen north, where 9 men against a plant could change history with a single night's work. Far to the east and south, the resistance took a different shape entirely, vaster, grimmer, fought not by handfuls of trained commandos against a single target but by whole populations against an occupation designed to destroy them. In Norway, the Germans murdered captured commandos and called it policy. In Poland, the occupation was not a policy of reprisal. It was a policy of annihilation, applied to an entire nation, and the resistance that rose against it was the largest underground movement in the history of Europe, an entire secret state with its own army and its own courts and its own schools, living beneath the surface of a country the Germans intended to erase. And in the mountains of the Balkans, the partisans fought a war so brutal, so tangled with civil war and reprisal and survival, that it would tie down German divisions desperately needed elsewhere and write some of the most savage chapters of the entire conflict. The men of Telemark fought the cold and a plant. The men and women of the East fought something far larger, and they paid for it in numbers that make the Norwegian story, for all its courage, look like a single candle against a burning continent. It is to that continent, and to that fire that we now turn. If the resistance of France was a war of nerves fought in cafés and farmhouses, the resistance of the East was something else entirely. It was larger, it was older, and it was fought in the full knowledge that capture meant not a prison cell but a wall, and that the wall would not be the end of it, because before the wall there would be a cellar, and in the cellar there would be questions, and the questions would have names attached, and those names would be your friends. Nowhere was this truer than in Poland. Poland had been the first country to fall, in September 1939, crushed between Germany advancing from the west and the Soviet Union advancing from the east, 2 empires dividing a nation between them in a matter of weeks. But Poland did not surrender in the way that surrender is usually understood. The government fled into exile, first to France and then to London, but it never signed an armistice, never accepted defeat as final. And underneath the occupation, in the cellars and the forests and the back rooms of a country that had simply refused to stop existing, something began to grow that had no equal anywhere else in occupied Europe. The Poles called it the Armia Krajowa, the Home Army. By 1943 it numbered in the hundreds of thousands, by some estimates more than 400,000 sworn members, making it the largest resistance movement in all of occupied Europe. But the number, staggering as it is, does not capture what made the Polish underground extraordinary. What made it extraordinary was that it was not merely an army. It was a state. Beneath the German occupation, the Poles built an entire secret country. There was an underground parliament that met in private apartments, its delegates risking execution simply by gathering. There were underground courts that tried collaborators and informers, that handed down sentences that maintained, under conditions where the very concept seemed absurd, a functioning system of law. There were underground universities where professors who had been forbidden to teach taught anyway, in living rooms to students who could be shot for attending a lecture. Tens of thousands of young Poles received their education this way, in a country where education itself had been declared a crime. There was an underground press of such scale that the Germans, with all their resources, could never suppress it. Hundreds of clandestine newspapers, printed on presses hidden in cellars and attics, the type set by hand in the dark, the finished sheets carried through the streets by couriers who knew that the bundle under their coat was a death sentence if they were stopped. Imagine the work of it. A printing press is not a quiet thing. It is heavy, it is mechanical, it clatters and thumps, and it must be operated for hours to produce a meaningful run. The men and women who ran the underground presses worked in basements with the windows blacked out and rags stuffed against the doors to muffle the sound, listening always for footsteps on the stairs above. They printed news from London picked up on hidden radios. They printed instructions, warnings, lists of collaborators marked for the underground courts. And they printed something harder to name, the simple, defiant insistence that Poland still existed, that the occupation was a temporary condition and not a permanent fact. To a population the Germans were trying to grind into silence, the appearance of a newspaper was proof that the silence was a lie. But the printing press in the cellar was only the visible edge of something much darker that the Polish underground had learned, and could not unlearn. Because the Home Army saw things that the rest of the world had not yet allowed itself to believe. Poland was where the machinery of the Holocaust was built. The camps were on Polish soil. The trains ran through Polish stations. The Polish underground, its couriers moving through the country, its members positioned in railway offices and town halls and the edges of the occupation's bureaucracy, accumulated, piece by piece, an understanding of what was happening that almost no one outside the occupied East yet possessed. They knew because they could see the trains. They knew because they could count the people who went in and did not come out. They knew because some of their own people had stood, deliberately, where they could witness it and had brought back what they saw. And the Home Army faced a question that has no comfortable answer. What do you do with knowledge that the world does not want to hear? They decided to try to tell it. And they chose a man to carry it. His name was Jan Karski, and before the war he had been a promising young diplomat, fluent in several languages, gifted with a near-photographic memory, the kind of bright, ambitious man who in another life would have spent the 1940s climbing the rungs of an embassy. Instead he became a courier for the Polish underground, one of the men who carried information between occupied Poland and the government in exile in London. It was work that required him to cross occupied Europe again and again, moving through checkpoints and across borders with information memorized rather than written down, because anything written could be found. He had already paid for the work once. Captured by the Gestapo on an earlier mission, tortured, he had slashed his own wrists in a hospital rather than risk breaking under interrogation and betraying the network. He survived. The underground engineered his escape, and he went back to the work. In 1942, as he prepared for a mission to London, Jewish leaders in the underground came to him with a request that would define the rest of his life. Before he carried the message of the Polish resistance to the West, they wanted him to see, with his own eyes, what was being done to the Jews of Poland, so that he could testify to it not as rumor but as a witness. He agreed. They smuggled him into the Warsaw Ghetto twice through a tunnel so that he could walk its streets and see the starvation and the dying and the bodies. And then, disguised, he was taken to the edge of what he was told was a death camp, where he watched, through a fence, scenes that he would spend the rest of his life unable to fully describe and unable to forget. Then he memorized it all and he carried it west. This is the part of the story that breaks the heart. Karski reached London. Then he reached Washington. He met with the foreign minister of the Polish government in exile, with British officials, with members of the press. He met with Anthony Eden, the British Foreign Secretary. And eventually, in July 1943, he met with the President of the United States himself, Franklin Roosevelt, in the Oval Office. He told them what he had seen. He told them in detail what was happening to the Jews of Europe while it was still happening, while there was still time. And he was, in the most important sense, not believed. Not called a liar exactly. The men he spoke to were polite. Some were moved. But the scale of what he described was so far outside the boundary of what they were prepared to accept as real that it could not land. There is a famous account of Karski meeting with a Supreme Court Justice, Felix Frankfurter, himself a Jew. After listening to Karski's testimony, Frankfurter said that he could not believe him. When the Polish ambassador protested that Karski was telling the truth, Frankfurter clarified. He did not mean that Karski was lying. He meant, I did not say that he is lying. I said that I am unable to believe him. There is a difference. That difference is the whole tragedy of it. The information arrived. The witness was real. The testimony was true and accurate and delivered at the highest possible levels in time. And the human mind, confronted with a horror that exceeded its capacity to imagine, simply declined to absorb it. Karski had crossed occupied Europe, had been tortured, had walked through the ghetto and stood at the fence and carried it all the way to the desk of the most powerful man on earth. And the wall he could not breach was not made of concrete. It was made of disbelief. Karski lived another half-century. He became a professor in America. For decades he barely spoke of it. And when he did speak, near the end of his life, what came through was not bitterness so much as a kind of permanent grief. The grief of a man who had done everything that could be done, and watched it not be enough. This was the experience of the resistance in the East, distilled into one man's journey. To know the truth, to risk everything to deliver it, and to find that the West's help, when it came at all, came late and small. Because the West's help did come small. The Polish Home Army fought for years, sabotaging German rail lines, gathering intelligence, assassinating Gestapo officials, building toward the moment when they could rise. And when that moment came, when Warsaw rose in open revolt in the summer of 1944, the Home Army fighting the Germans street by street in their own capital, the help they had been promised did not arrive in the measure they needed. The Soviet army halted on the far bank of the river and waited while the rising was crushed. Supply drops from the Western Air Forces were heroic in the flying and tragic in the quantity. The planes crossing immense distances at terrible loss to drop containers that scattered across a burning city, as often falling into German hands as Polish ones. But that is a story for later in this telling. Hold the image of Warsaw Rising and understand for now only this, that the Polish underground was the largest, the most complete, and in the end perhaps the most heartbroken of all the resistance movements because it gave everything and saw the world's help arrive in fragments and went on fighting anyway. Not every Eastern resistance fought from the shadows. In the mountains of Yugoslavia, the war was waged in the open. Yugoslavia was a country of mountains and feuds, of many peoples and old grievances, invaded and dismembered by Germany and Italy in 1941. And in its broken interior, two resistance movements rose, and, in a complication that the Western Allies found maddening, the two movements spent a good deal of the war fighting each other as well as the occupiers. But it was the second of them, the communist-led partisans under a man who called himself Tito, that became something the rest of occupied Europe could scarcely imagine. Not an underground, but an army in the field. Tito's partisans did not hide in cellars and slip out at night. They held territory. They marched in columns across mountain ridges, tens of thousands strong, with their own field hospitals carried on stretchers and the backs of mules, their own command structure, their own grim discipline. They were hunted relentlessly. The Germans launched offensive after offensive into the mountains to destroy them, and several times very nearly did. There were marches in which the partisans, encircled, carrying their wounded because they would not leave them to be killed, broke out across freezing rivers and over mountain passes with losses that should have ended them as a fighting force. They did not end. They reformed in the high country and came back down. What the partisans achieved was strategic in a way that the cellar presses and the lone couriers, for all their courage, could not be. By tying down many German divisions in the mountains of the Balkans, divisions that might otherwise have stood on other fronts, they shifted the weight of the whole war by a measurable amount. The Western Allies, who had at first backed the rival movement, eventually concluded that Tito was the man actually fighting the Germans, and threw their support to him. Here, at least, the help was real and it arrived and it mattered. But for every partisan on a mountain ridge in the Balkans, there were 100 resistors in cellars and apartments across the East who fought with no army behind them and no mountain to flee into, only the dark and the network, and the knowledge of what would happen if the network broke. And across all of it, in Poland and Yugoslavia and everywhere the resistance burned, the same machine was closing in. It moved through the occupied East with patience and method. It did not need to win battles. It needed only one thing, a name. One frightened courier, one tortured printer, one informer hungry enough or terrified enough to talk, and a thread would come loose, and the men in the leather coats would begin to pull it, and a whole network built over years could unravel in a single week. In the cellars, the candles burned low over the maps and the lists, and the men and women who bent over them had all learned the same arithmetic. Every meeting was a risk. Every courier was a thread. And somewhere in the city, in an ordinary building with ordinary offices, sat the patient apparatus whose entire purpose was to find the thread and pull. They feared one word above all others. They feared the Gestapo. And the terrible thing about the Gestapo, the thing that made it more dangerous than any army, was that it almost never came for you in the open. Came because someone had talked. Came because of betrayal. There is a particular kind of fear that does not come from artillery, or from the sound of boots on a stairwell, or from the cold weight of a pistol pressed against the back of the neck. It is quieter than any of those. It is the fear that the man sitting across from you in the cafe, the one who has been generous with information, who has hands that shake when he talks about the Germans, who calls them by the worst names he knows, is not who he says he is. It is the fear of the friend. And it was, for everyone who worked in the secret war of occupied Europe, the most corrosive fear of all. By the middle of 1943, the resistance networks that had grown across France and Holland and Belgium and Norway had become something the Germans could no longer ignore. In the first years they had been an irritation, a matter for the local police. Now they were a strategic threat, and the Germans responded the way a serious power responds to a serious threat. They did not simply hunt the resistance. They studied it. They learned how it thought. The men who did this work wore the uniform of the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, and the Geheime Staatspolizei, the Gestapo, and the Military Intelligence Service, the Abwehr. They were not, most of them, the cartoon sadists of later films. The most dangerous of them were patient, intelligent, and methodical men who understood that the way to destroy a clandestine organization was not to torture one agent into giving up one address. It was to turn the organization's own structure against it, to find the single weak thread and pull until the entire fabric came apart in your hands. And here was the cruel arithmetic of the underground. Everything that made a network safe also made it fragile. The cells were kept small and separate so that the capture of one man could not betray the others, but that same separation meant that no one could verify anyone outside their own tiny circle. Identities were false, histories invented, real names never spoken, but that meant a man could be anyone, and you had only his word for who he was. The whole system ran on trust extended to people you were forbidden to truly know. The Germans understood this perfectly. And they understood that the fastest way into a sealed network was not to break the door down. It was to be invited in. The informer was the oldest weapon and the simplest. Occupied Europe was a place of hunger and fear and impossible choices, and the Germans had learned to offer things that hungry, frightened people found very hard to refuse. Money, in a place where money had become the difference between a child eating and not eating. The release of a husband or a brother already in a cell at Frane's prison or Natzweiler camp. Sometimes simply the promise that this time the questioning would stop. A few informers were true believers, fascists who thought they were on the right side. Most were not. Most were ordinary people who had been broken in a very specific and deliberate way, who gave up a name to save someone they loved, and who then discovered that the first name is never the last, that once you have begun you belong to them, and that they will keep coming back until there is nothing left to give. What this did to the people of the resistance was something that the survivors spoke about for the rest of their lives, when they spoke about it at all. It was not the danger from the enemy that wore them down. It was the impossibility of knowing who the enemy was. A network that has been penetrated does not feel penetrated. It feels exactly like a network that is safe, until the morning the cars arrive at 6 addresses at once and every one of them is correct. The men and women of the underground learned to read faces for things that could not be read, to test new recruits with questions whose answers meant nothing, to lie awake calculating which of their friends might already have been turned. Some of them broke under that weight long before the Gestapo ever found them. The secret war was, more than anything else, a war of nerves, fought in the space between one human being and another, and it was merciless. Then there were the double agents, and this was a different and more dangerous thing than the informer. The informer betrayed from outside. The double agent betrayed from within while continuing to play his part, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. He came to the meetings. He carried the messages. He knew the safe houses and the couriers and the wireless operators, and he reported all of it to a German handler, and the network went on believing it was whole. The resistance memoirs of the war are full of these figures, and they are full of a particular bitterness reserved for them, because the informer was a victim of the occupation in a way, but the man who looked you in the eye and shook your hand and called you comrade while he was selling you was something else entirely. He was the thing the underground feared most, given a face. And the worst of it was that you could not be sure. You could spend the war never knowing whether the man who escaped when you were caught had been lucky or had been the one who arranged it. But of all the weapons the German counterintelligence services turned against the secret war, the most ingenious, and in the end the most lethal, did not require an informer or a traitor at all. It required only a captured radio, a captured operator, and patience. The Germans called it the Funkspiel, the radio game. To understand why it was so devastating, you have to understand how the underground breathed. Every network in occupied Europe lived or died by its connection to London. That connection was the wireless set, a suitcase radio, a transmitter the size of a large book, operated by a man or a woman who tapped out messages in Morse code to a receiving station in England and listened, at fixed times on fixed frequencies, for the answers that came back. Arms drops, money, orders, the names of new agents being parachuted in, the dates and the fields and the recognition signals, all of it flowed through the wireless. The operator was the most important and the most exposed person in any network. London could not see occupied Europe. It could only hear it through the steady tapping of a key in an attic somewhere, and it had to trust that the hand on the key was a friend. The Germans understood that if they could capture that hand, and capture it without London knowing, they would not just have shut down one radio. They would have opened a door directly into the heart of the enemy's headquarters, and they could leave it open for as long as they liked. In the Netherlands, in the spring of 1942, they did exactly that, and the operation that followed became the most catastrophic intelligence failure of the entire secret war. The Germans called it Operation North Pole. History has remembered it by a single bitter word, the Englandspiel, the England game. It began with the capture of one agent and his wireless set near The Hague. The agent's name was Hubertus Lauwers, a young Dutchman who had been trained in England and dropped into his occupied homeland to build a network. The man who captured him was an Abwehr officer named Hermann Gisks, and Gisks was precisely the kind of patient, intelligent enemy the underground had most reason to fear. He did not want to shoot Lauwers. He wanted Lauwers to keep transmitting to London in his own hand on his own set as though nothing had happened. And he made it clear what the alternative was. What happened next turned on a detail that almost no one outside the wireless world understood, and that would haunt the survivors for decades. Every agent trained in England was given what was called a security check, a deliberate mistake, a particular flaw built into their transmissions that they were to include only when transmitting freely. Misspell a particular word. Insert an error at a fixed interval. The absence of that mistake was a silent scream. I am captured. Do not trust this set. Every word that follows is the enemy speaking. Lauwers, forced to transmit under German control, did exactly what he had been trained to do. He left out his security check. He sent London the signal that meant his radio was in enemy hands. And London did not notice. The message came back as though nothing were wrong. London replied warmly with operational details and asked when the next agent could be received. Lauwers, sitting at the key with a German officer at his shoulder, must have felt the floor open beneath him. He had done the one thing he could do, the thing the whole system existed to allow him to do, and it had vanished into silence on the other end. Whether the omission was overlooked or dismissed as a transmission error, or simply not understood by the staff who handled the traffic, the result was the same. The door was open and London did not know it. What followed unfolded over nearly 2 years, and it has the quality of a slow nightmare. Gisks, playing Lauwers' set and then others, transmitted to London in the names of captured agents, and London answered. London asked where to send the next man. Gisks told them. London sent him. The agent parachuted down into the dark fields of Holland, his recognition signals correct, his reception committee waiting, and the reception committee was the Germans, standing in the drop zone, waiting to take him the moment his feet touched the earth. They took his weapons, his money, his codes, and very often his own wireless set, which they then added to the game. They asked the next questions. London sent the next man. And so it went, drop after drop, month after month. An entire pipeline of brave men funneled out of England and delivered, with London's own cooperation, straight into a German cell. The numbers, when they finally became clear after the war, were almost impossible to absorb. More than 50 agents dropped into the Netherlands, walked into German hands the moment they landed. Tons of weapons and supplies, intended to arm the Dutch resistance, were collected by the men they were meant to be used against. The arms that London thought it was building into a clandestine army in Holland were instead piling up in German warehouses, catalogued, while the resistance the radios described, confident, growing, well-supplied, did not exist at all. It was a phantom, conjured nightly out of Morse code by a German officer in The Hague, and London paid for the illusion in the lives of its own people, one parachute at a time. The horror of the radio game was not its violence. It was its quiet. There was no battle, no last stand, nothing to mark the disaster as it was happening. There was only the steady, reassuring rhythm of a familiar hand on a key, telling London that everything was fine. The men who were captured knew the truth, and most of them could do nothing about it. Some, like Lowers, tried again and again to slip a warning into the traffic. A phrase, an error, anything, and watched it fail to register, month after month, while their friends kept dropping out of the sky into the waiting dark. To understand that you are the bait, and that you cannot stop the trap from being baited with the lives of men you have never met, and to live with that knowledge in a prison cell while the game goes on without you, there are few things the secret war asked of anyone that were worse than that. The England spiel finally ended not because London grew suspicious, but because the underground itself broke the silence. Two captured agents, Peter Durlian and Johanna Benck, did what almost no one managed. They escaped from German custody, crossed occupied Europe on foot and by rail through Belgium and France and into Switzerland, and from there got word back to England that the Dutch networks were a German fiction and had been for 2 years. Even then, they were not believed at first. So total had the deception been that London's first instinct was to suspect the men who escaped, not the radios that had lied. But the truth could not be held back forever. Gisks himself, with a kind of cold professional courtesy, eventually sent a final message in plain English to the British, thanking them for their long and excellent cooperation, and informing them that any further agents they cared to send would, regrettably, receive the same warm welcome as all the others. It was a closing salute from one professional to another, and it was the most damning sentence written about the secret war by anyone who lived through it. What that disaster bought, in the end, was knowledge paid for at a price no one should have had to pay. The men who ran the secret war learned, the hardest way there is, that a radio is only as trustworthy as the proof that a free hand is sending it, that a security check ignored is a death warrant signed, that the absence of a warning is not the same as the presence of safety. The procedures changed. The checks were taken seriously. New systems were built so that a captured operator could never again be turned into a weapon against the men he had trained beside. The agents who dropped into Europe in the months before D-Day owed their lives, in part, to the ones who had dropped into Holland and vanished, and who in vanishing had taught London a lesson it would never forget. And there is one more thing to say about the people caught in the German nets, because it is the thing that matters most and the thing that is hardest to say plainly. Many of them did not break. We will not dwell on what was done to them in the cells of Avenue Foch in Paris, or in the prisons of The Hague, or in the camps where so many of them ended. It is enough to know that the methods were what you fear they were, and that the men and women who endured them had been told the truth before they ever left England, that capture meant a kind of suffering most people are never asked to imagine, and that the network they protected was worth more than their own silence could ever cost them. Some held out for the 48 hours they were trained to give, the time their comrades needed to scatter and go dark, and then held out longer and longer still, far past anything that was asked of them. There were operators who sent false confessions in code, embedding warnings inside the very statements their captors forced from them. There were agents who gave the Germans names, but the wrong names, names of the dead, names of people safely in England, names that sent the Gestapo chasing ghosts down empty streets while the living slipped away. The courage of these people was not the courage of the battlefield, where there is noise and motion and the company of others. It was the loneliest courage there is, the courage of a single human being, in a small room with no witnesses and no help coming, deciding over and over again, hour by hour, to say nothing. We do not know most of their names. The records were burned or never kept or sealed for half a century. But the people they protected lived, and the networks they refused to betray were still standing when the moment came. Because the moment was coming now. By the spring of 1944, the secret war had been fought in shadow for 4 years, in cafes and attics and the back rooms of farmhouses, in code and silence and the terrible patience of people who could not strike openly. It had cost an enormous price, and much of it had been paid in exactly the way this chapter has described. Quietly, anonymously, in cells and on the wrong end of a radio that had been turned. But all of that, the informers and the double agents, the radio games and the long silences in the interrogation rooms, all of it had been preparation for a single day. The arms caches that had survived the betrayals were buried in barns across France. The networks that had not been rolled up were waiting, holding their breath, listening to the wireless for one particular set of words. The men who had spent 4 years learning to disappear were about to be asked to do the opposite, to stand up in daylight all at once and fight in the open. Across the Channel, the greatest invasion fleet in the history of the world was being assembled in the harbors and inlets of southern England. And in the fields and forests of occupied Europe, the secret army that 4 years of shadow war had built, the survivors, the ones the betrayals had not reached, the ones who had endured the cells in silence and the ones who had simply, against every odd, lived, that army was about to receive the order it had been waiting for since the first day of the occupation. The order to rise. For 4 years, the resistance had lived in fragments. A printing press in a cellar. A wireless operator changing safe houses every 3 days. A railwayman who memorized the contents of German freight cars and passed them, in a whisper at a cafe table, to a man he would never meet again. It had been a war of patience, of small acts accumulated against an enemy that controlled the roads, the telephones, the trains, the radio, and the night itself. The men and women who fought it had grown used to the idea that their work was preparation, that the real war, the war of armies and tanks and beaches, belonged to someone else, somewhere else, in a future none of them could be sure they would live to see. Then, in the late spring of 1944, that future began to announce itself in the strangest possible way, through poetry. Every evening, on the French-language broadcasts of the BBC from London, after the news bulletins and before the sign-off, there came a string of sentences that made no sense. They were absurd, dreamlike, deliberately meaningless. The dice are on the table. John has a long mustache. The Trojan War will not take place. It is hot in Suez. A French listener tuning in by accident would have thought the announcer had lost his mind, or that the war had finally broken something in the people who ran the broadcasts. But across France, in cellars and farmhouses and back rooms with the shutters closed and the volume turned down so low that a family had to lean their heads together over the set, men and women sat very still and listened for one specific phrase. Each circuit, each network, each isolated cell had been assigned its own line. A personal message that meant nothing to anyone but them, and meant everything to the few who had been told to wait for it. These were the message's personnels, and they were the nervous system of the secret army. For most of 1944 they carried small, specific instructions, a parachute drop confirmed for a particular field, a courier to be expected, a sabotage job to be carried out on a named date. But two of them, two halves of a single sentence borrowed from a poem written half a century earlier, had been set aside for the most important signal of the entire war. The poem was by Paul Verlaine, Chanson d'automne. A melancholy little thing about autumn and violins and the passage of time. And in the first days of June 1944, the men of the resistance who knew what to listen for began to hear its opening line. Imagine sitting in that room. The radio is forbidden. Listening to London carries a prison sentence, and worse. The set is hidden behind a false panel or buried in a barn between broadcasts. You have leaned your ear to the cloth of the speaker, and through the hiss and the German jamming, you hear it. Les sanglots longs de violons de l'automne. The long sobs of the autumn violins. You straighten up. You look at the others in the room and you do not need to speak because every one of you has understood the same thing at the same instant. The first half of the message has been broadcast. The invasion is coming. Not next month, not in some vague spring of liberation, now, within days. Get ready. It was an alert, not an order. It told them to stand by, to bring in the dispersed teams, to prepare the explosives and check the weapons buried in the orchards. And then they waited again, listening every evening for the second line, the line that would mean go. What none of them in those rooms could know, what was almost too dangerous to know, was that they were not alone. The same alert was reaching hundreds of other rooms, in Brittany and Burgundy and the high plateaus of the Massif Central, in the hills above Lyon and the marshes of the Loire. A secret army that had spent 4 years deliberately keeping its right hand ignorant of what its left hand was doing, splintered into cells precisely so that no captured man could betray more than a handful of others, was about to act in concert for the first time. Tens of thousands of people who had never met, who would never meet, who knew each other only as code names and dead-letter drops, were being told to rise together on the same night. The second line came on the evening of June 5th. Blessant mon cœur d'une longueur monotone. Wound my heart with a monotonous languor. It meant, begin. It meant the sabotage plans that had been drawn up in London over the preceding year, given names like Plan Vert for the railways, Plan Blue for the electrical grid, Plan Violet for the telephone and telegraph lines, Plan Tortue for the roads, were now live. It meant that within hours, across the whole of occupied France, men and women were going to walk out into the dark and begin the most coordinated act of sabotage in the history of warfare. And here is the thing that the planners in London had understood, and that the Germans, for all their experience, had badly underestimated. The invasion of Normandy did not depend only on the men coming ashore. It depended on the men who could not come ashore, the German reserves, the panzer divisions, the infantry sitting in garrisons hundreds of miles from the coast. If those forces could reach the beachhead quickly, in the first days while the Allied foothold was still shallow and fragile, they could push it back into the sea. Everything turned on speed. And the entire transport network those reinforcements would have to travel, the rail lines, the locomotives, the bridges, the telephone exchanges that allowed German commanders to coordinate their movement, ran through territory held invisibly by the resistance. So on the night of June 5th into the 6th, while the gliders were casting off over the Channel and the first parachutes were opening over the Cotentin Peninsula, a second invasion began. This one had no beaches. It happened in goods yards and signal boxes, at the base of telegraph poles, on the embankments of railway cuttings. It was carried out by farmers and schoolteachers and out-of-work mechanics, by teenagers and grandfathers, by people whose names appear in no official history because the only record of what they did that night is the silence of the lines that stopped working. Consider what it actually meant to cut a telephone line in 1944. It was not a matter of snipping a single wire. The long-distance trunk cables that linked German headquarters to its scattered units were buried, armored, sometimes laid in concrete ducts, and patrolled. To sever them in a way that could not be quickly repaired, a saboteur had to know where the cable ran, had to dig down to it under cover of darkness, often in a roadside ditch in full view of any passing patrol, had to cut through the steel sheathing, and then, this was the refinement that separated a nuisance from a catastrophe. Drag away a long section of the cable and bury it somewhere else, so that the repair crews could not simply splice the two ends back together but had to find and replace the missing length entirely. A team of 3 could black out the communications of an entire region for days. And the railwaymen, the Cheminots, who knew the network better than the Germans who occupied it, knew exactly which sections to attack. Not the open track, easily repaired, but the points and crossings and the locomotives themselves, the things that took weeks to replace and could not be improvised. That night they cut the rail lines in nearly 1,000 places. Picture a single one of those acts because the 1,000 are too many to hold in the mind at once. A railway embankment somewhere in central France. Well after midnight. 3 men come up out of a wood, carrying between them a satchel of plastic explosive, the soft, putty-like material that the parachute drops had been bringing in for months, that could be molded by hand and pressed against a rail and shaped to cut the steel cleanly. One of them is a local railwayman. He has chosen this spot because just beyond the curve is a cutting where a derailed train will block the line for the longest possible time and be the hardest to clear. They work fast and almost without speaking. They mold the charge, set a time pencil, a small chemical fuse that gives them a calculated number of minutes to get clear. And then they go back into the wood and wait, and a few minutes later there is a flash that lights the underside of the clouds, and a sound that rolls across the fields, and the rail is gone. A meter of it simply vaporized, the ends twisted up into the air. When the next German troop train comes through in the darkness, traveling fast because every hour matters, it will find no rail beneath it. Multiply that by hundreds. Across Normandy and Brittany and the approaches to the front, the railways that the German army needed in order to rush its reserves toward the invasion simply ceased to function. Locomotives derailed. Lines blocked by their own wreckage. Telephone exchanges dead, so that commanders calling for orders heard nothing on the line. A German staff officer trying to understand the situation in those first hours found himself blind and deaf in his own territory, unable to move his forces, unable even to talk to them. But that's only half of what rose out of the dark that night. Because alongside the saboteurs, who struck and vanished, there were the Maquis, and the Maquis did not vanish. They stood up. The word Maquis comes from the dense scrub of the Mediterranean hills, the thorny brush where a man could disappear, and it had been given to the bands of men who had taken to the forests and the mountains rather than be shipped to Germany as forced labor. For months and years they had hidden, drilled in secret, lived rough on what the surrounding villages could spare. They were not soldiers in any conventional sense. Many had never fired a shot in anger. And on the strength of the messages from London and the conviction that liberation was finally at hand, in region after region they came down out of the hills, raised whatever flag they had, and declared open war on the occupier in broad daylight. In some places this was exactly what London had wanted. Harassment, ambush, the cutting of roads, the tying down of German units that should have been racing north. In other places it was a tragedy in the making, because the Maquis were lightly armed men of courage facing an enemy that still possessed tanks and artillery and aircraft and the willingness to use all of them without restraint. But that is to look ahead. On the night of the rising itself, what mattered was that a hidden army had become a visible one, and that across great stretches of France the Germans suddenly found the countryside behind their own lines turning hostile and armed. Into that rising came men falling out of the sky. They were called the Jedburghs, a name chosen at random the way the British liked to choose such names, after a town in the Scottish borders. They came in teams of 3, usually one British or American officer, one French officer, and a radio operator, dropped by parachute behind the lines in uniform. The uniform mattered enormously. These were not spies who would be shot if caught. They were soldiers sent openly to do an openly military job, to find the local resistance in the Maquis, to bring them arms and money and the authority of the Allied command, to weld scattered bands of irregulars into something that could be directed and supplied and pointed at targets that mattered. They jumped at night, often at dusk so the drop zone could still be seen, into fields marked by nothing more than 3 flashlights and a bonfire and a handful of nervous strangers waiting below who might, for all the Jedburgh knew as he stepped out the door, be Germans who had captured the reception committee and were waiting to capture him too. Imagine that moment. You are a young officer, 23, 24 years old. You have trained for a year. The aircraft engines change pitch as the plane throttles back over the drop zone. The dispatcher slaps your shoulder. You drop through the hole in the floor of the fuselage into a rush of cold air and engine noise, and then the canopy cracks open above you and suddenly there is only silence and the dark shapes of fields tilting up toward you, and you do not know, you cannot know, whether the men holding those 3 small lights are friends or a firing squad. You land hard in a French meadow. Figures come running toward you out of the night. And then, almost always, a hand grips yours, and a voice says in French, "Welcome, we have been waiting a long time for you." In the weeks after D-Day, dozens of these teams dropped across France. They armed the Maquis, organized the sabotage, called in supply flights, and in some cases led their irregulars into actual battle. And they tied the secret war to the Great War on the beaches, so that the man huddled in a Norman hedgerow and the man parachuting into the Auvergne were, for the first time, fighting the same fight under the same command. The effect on the German army was real and measurable. The most famous case became a kind of legend, though the legend rests on hard fact. An entire SS Panzer division, one of the most powerful armored formations the Germans possessed, was stationed in the south of France when the invasion began. Ordered north to crush the beachhead, it should have made the journey in 3 days. Instead, it took the better part of 2 weeks. The railways it needed had been cut so thoroughly that its tanks had to grind north on their own tracks, wearing themselves out on the roads, harassed at every turn by ambushes and blown bridges, slowed by a countryside that fought it the whole way. By the time it reached the front, The Allies were ashore and dug in and could not be dislodged. Days mattered. The resistance had taken those days from the enemy and given them to the men on the beaches, and no one who waited ashore in Normandy ever knew the names of the people who had bought them that time. But triumph in this war was never clean, and it was never free. We have to be honest about what the rising cost, because the people who paid for it deserve that honesty. The German response to a population in arms was the response it had perfected across occupied Europe. Collective punishment, deliberate and pitiless, designed not to defeat the resistance militarily but to terrorize the civilians who sheltered it. Where the Maquis had risen and could not be quickly beaten, the occupier turned on the villages. The reprisals of that summer carved names into French memory that have never faded. Places where, in retaliation for the work of the secret army, the inhabitants paid a price out of all proportion to anything they themselves had done. The histories record the numbers. We do not need to dwell on the details to understand the shape of it. A village suspected of sheltering fighters could be surrounded at dawn, its men taken, its houses burned, its population destroyed in an afternoon, the whole thing carried out as a lesson meant to be read by every other village for 100 miles. The Maquis who had come down from the hills in the first joy of the rising sometimes found that their liberation had brought down on the people who fed them a punishment those people had not chosen and could not survive. This was the arithmetic the resistance had always lived inside, and that summer it came due in full. Every railway cut, every German convoy ambushed, every hour stolen from the enemy's reinforcement of the front, was real and mattered and helped to win the war. And the reprisals were also real, and the dead in the burned villages were also real, and the men and women who had given the orders to rise had to carry both of those truths at once for the rest of their lives. Some of them said, afterward, that they would do it all again because the alternative was a Europe that stayed enslaved. Some of them could never quite say that, and lived out their years with the faces of the dead in front of them. Both of those responses are human, and neither one is wrong. What is certain is that the secret army did not fight in vain. Through that summer, as the Allied armies broke out of Normandy at last and began to fan across France, the resistance went before them and beside them. They guarded bridges so the retreating Germans could not blow them. They cleared towns ahead of the advancing columns. They handed over, to astonished Allied officers, detailed intelligence on German positions gathered by people who had been living among the enemy for 4 years. In great cities the rising became open insurrection, the population pouring into the streets to claim its own liberation before the regular armies even arrived. And the liberation, once it began to move, moved fast, town after town, region after region, the map of occupied Europe shrinking week by week as the long stalemate broke and the tide that had been held back since 1940 finally came surging in. It is tempting to end there, on the image of the crowds in the streets and the church bells ringing across a freed countryside. That image is true, and the people in it had earned every moment of their joy. But it is not the whole truth, and this story has never been in the business of telling less than the whole truth. Because as the armies swept forward and the occupied lands fell free one after another, a question went with them that no parade and no ringing bell could answer. What had it cost? Not in the strategic ledger of divisions and railway lines and days gained and lost. That account, at least, could be added up. The other cost. The men who had jumped into the dark and never been heard from again. The wireless operators caught at their sets and the radio silence that followed. The villages that were no longer there. The fighters who had survived 4 years of clandestine war only to die in the last summer of it, within sight of the freedom they had given everything to reach. The families who would spend the rest of their lives not knowing, exactly, where a son or a husband had fallen, because the secret war kept its secrets even from those who loved the people it consumed. The war was being won. That much, by that summer, was no longer in doubt. But the winning had a price written underneath it in a column that no one had yet sat down to total. And as the liberation rolled across Europe and the end at last came into view, the people who had fought the longest and given the most were beginning to understand that the reckoning still lay ahead of them. Not the reckoning with the enemy. The reckoning with what the whole thing had taken, and with what was owed to the ones who did not come back to collect it. And so we come, at last, to the summer of liberation, to the moment when the secret war we have been following through 11 chapters of the story finally surfaced into the daylight, and the people who had lived underground for years stepped out into streets that were, for the first time since 1940, their own. It did not happen all at once. Liberation never does. It came as a rumor first, the sound of artillery moving in the wrong direction, the change in the behavior of the German garrisons, the sudden nervousness of men who had spent 4 years being feared and who now, for the first time, were beginning to be afraid. In the villages of Normandy in June of 1944, in the hills of the Vercors in July, in the streets of Paris in August, in the towns of the Low Countries through that autumn, the same scene repeated itself with local variations. The Germans pulled back. The shooting moved past. And then, in the strange silence that follows the departure of an occupying army, people who had hidden radios and forged papers and slept with one ear listening for boots on the stair came out of their houses, blinking, and discovered that the war they had fought in the dark was over. For the men and women of the secret war, that moment was not simple. It was not the clean triumph of the newsreels. Consider what the liberation actually meant for the agent who had spent 2 years building a circuit in the south of France. Through all that time, the work had been the secret war. Coded messages, dead drops, the careful cultivation of railway workers and farmers, and the woman at the post office who steamed open the right envelopes. The work had a shape. It had a purpose that fit inside a single day. Stay alive, stay invisible, send the message, meet the drop. And then the tanks came through, and overnight the entire structure of that life dissolved. The radio that had been worth more than gold was now just a radio. The pistol hidden in the flour bin was now just a pistol. The face that had been a liability, recognized, hunted, photographed on a Gestapo wall, was suddenly only a face in a crowd, anonymous again, ordinary again. And many of the people who had carried that weight for years found, in the first hours of freedom, not joy but a kind of vertigo. They had forgotten how to be ordinary. The war had taught them to trust no one, and now they were being asked to trust everyone, and the muscle that does that had atrophied to nothing. There is a phrase that survivors of the resistance used, again and again, in the testimonies recorded decades later. They said, "The liberation was the loneliest day of my life." And when you understand what the secret war had been, a brotherhood and sisterhood forged in absolute danger, where the person beside you was the only person on earth who knew what you knew and risked what you risked, you understand why. When the danger ended, the brotherhood ended with it. The thing that had bound them together was gone. They were free and they were alone. But before we follow them home, we have to account for the ones who did not come home. Because no honest reckoning of the secret war can begin anywhere else. The arithmetic of the resistance is brutal, and it has been softened too often by the romance that grew up around it after the fact. Of the agents that Britain's Special Operations Executive sent into occupied France, a significant fraction never returned, captured, interrogated, sent to the camps, executed. The networks they built were fragile by nature. A single arrest, a single broken man under torture, could unravel a circuit that had taken 18 months to assemble, and send a dozen people to their deaths in a week. The radio operators died at a rate that the planners in London knew about and accepted. The life expectancy of a clandestine wireless operator in occupied territory, by some grim internal estimates, was measured in weeks. They knew this when they trained them. The operators knew it too. They went anyway. And the women. We have spent time in this story on the women of the secret war because history spent so little, and the reckoning owes them more than a sentence. The couriers who carried messages in the lining of their coats and bicycled past checkpoints with their hearts hammering. The wireless operators who tapped out their transmissions knowing the German direction-finding vans were triangulating their position street by street. The ones who were captured and who were not treated gently because they were women, who were tortured in the same cellars and shot against the same walls and worked to death in the same camps as the men. Some of their names are known now. Most are not. They did the work and they paid the price and they vanished into the long silence of the unrecorded, and the most we can do at this distance is to say that we know they were there, and that what they did mattered, and that they were not forgotten by everyone because they are not forgotten by us here tonight. But the cost of the secret war was never paid only by the people who chose to fight it. It was paid again and again by people who chose nothing at all. This is the part of the story that the romance leaves out, and it is the part we are obliged to tell, because to honor the resistance without honoring its cost is to lie. When the resistance struck, when a train was derailed, a German officer shot, a bridge dropped into a river, the occupier did not respond by hunting the men who did it. The occupier responded by punishing the people who happened to live nearby. They had a doctrine for it. They had a ratio. For one German soldier killed, they would take 10 hostages or 50 or 100 from the surrounding villages and shoot them in the square as a lesson. The hostages were school teachers and farmers and grandfathers and boys. They had not derailed any trains. They had not fired any shots. They were chosen precisely because they were innocent, because the terror only worked if everyone understood that proximity to the resistance was itself a death sentence, that you could be guilty of nothing and die for it anyway. There were villages that ceased to exist. The names of some of them have become a kind of shorthand for what reprisal meant. Places where the entire population, men, women, and children, was herded together and murdered, the buildings burned, the wells poisoned, the very ground made into a monument to what an occupying army will do when it has decided that a people are not people. The men of the resistance who survived these reprisals carried a particular weight that the planners in London never had to carry. They had to live with the knowledge that their courage had a price, and that the price had been paid by their neighbors. There were resistance fighters who, after the war, could not return to the villages they came from. Not because they were ashamed of what they had done, but because everyone in that village had a grave to tend that the resistance had filled. The math of liberation does not balance cleanly. It never has. And so we have to ask the question that the whole of this story has been circling toward, the question that hangs over every one of these chapters like the smell of cordite over a field. Was it worth it? Did the secret war actually achieve anything? Did the sabotage and the radios and the forged papers and the murdered officers and the burned villages add up to something? Or was it all, in the cold accounting of strategy, a romantic footnote to a war that was won by tanks and bombers and the vast industrial machinery of nations? The honest answer is more interesting than the legend, and more durable. The secret war did not win the Second World War. It would be a disservice to the truth to claim that it did. The war was won by armies and by factories, by the millions of soldiers who fought in the open and the millions of workers who armed them. The resistance, measured against that scale, was small. But it was not nothing, and the people who study these things carefully have come to understand the specific ways in which it mattered. It mattered before the invasions, when the agents and their networks built the picture of the enemy's defenses that the planners needed, which gun batteries faced which beaches, which divisions sat in which towns, which bridges would have to be taken and which could be left. It mattered in the hours after the landings, when the railways the resistance had mapped were the railways the resistance cut, so that the German reinforcements rushing toward the beaches arrived late, or arrived in pieces or did not arrive at all. A single division held away from the front for 3 days by a sabotaged rail line, and a blown bridge is 3 days that the men on the beach do not have to face it. The soldiers who lived because of those 3 days never knew the names of the people who bought them. But the people bought them all the same. And it mattered in a way that does not appear in any strategic ledger, a way that is harder to measure and more important than all the rest. It mattered to the idea that a people under occupation are not defeated simply because their army has surrendered. The resistance was the proof, maintained at terrible cost for 4 years, that the occupied nations had not consented to their occupation, that beneath the surface of the apparent calm there was a refusal, persistent and unkillable, that no number of reprisals could extinguish. That refusal was the seed of everything that came after. It was the foundation on which the liberated nations rebuilt themselves, the answer to the question their children would one day ask. When it happened, what did we do? They could say, some of us fought. In the dark, with nothing, against everything. Some of us fought. And that answer, paid for in the lives we have been counting, was worth having. But you would not have known any of this from looking at most of the people who fought the secret war in the years after it ended. Because the strangest thing about them, the thing that is hardest to reconcile with the legend, is how completely most of them disappeared back into ordinary life. They did not all become heroes of the Republic, decorated and faded. A few did. Most went home. The woman who had run a courier network across 3 departments went back to being a schoolteacher and graded arithmetic, and her students never knew. The man who had blown the bridges went back to his farm, and mended fences and planted and harvested, and grew old beside fields that were quiet now. The radio operator who had transmitted under the noses of the direction-finding vans went back to a desk in an office in a town where no one had any idea, and answered the telephone and filed papers and said nothing. They married. They raised children. They sat at kitchen tables on winter evenings, and the war was a thing inside them that they did not speak of, and when their grandchildren asked, as Yakov Shapiro's granddaughter asked him in the story from a different front that opened this very film. They were quiet for a long time, and then they changed the subject, or they said something small and true and inadequate, and the rest stayed buried where it had always been. There is a photograph, or there are 1,000 photographs, taken across 1,000 quiet lives, of a man at a window. An ordinary man, in civilian clothes, in a room with a clock and a few books and the light of a late afternoon coming in. He is looking out at a field or a street or a garden, at nothing in particular. And if you did not know, you would think he was simply an old man at a window, the way old men are. You would not know that he had once carried a pistol against his ribs through a checkpoint with his papers forged in a cellar. You would not know that he had once watched his closest friend taken away in a car and had never seen him again. You would not know that the war that decided the shape of the world he was now looking out at was a war he had fought with his own 2 hands, in the dark, and had told almost no one about, and would carry unspoken to his grave. That is who they were. Not the figures of the monuments, though the monuments are right to be raised, and we should raise more of them. They were the man at the window, the schoolteacher who graded arithmetic, the farmer mending fences, the people who did an extraordinary thing in an extraordinary time, and then, when the time passed, simply went back to being ordinary, and let the world believe that ordinary was all they had ever been. And this is why they matter. This is the argument, the whole argument, of everything we have spent these hours together considering. They matter because they were not soldiers by trade and not heroes by temperament. They were not bred for war or selected for courage or trained from childhood to be brave. They were teachers and farmers and clerks and housewives and students and grandfathers, people exactly like the people in your own life, people exactly like you, who found themselves living through a moment when the easy thing and the right thing pointed in opposite directions, and who chose, quietly, without expectation of reward, often without expectation of survival, to do the right thing anyway. They are the proof that the line between an ordinary life and an extraordinary one is not drawn by birth. It is drawn by what you do when the moment comes and asks you who you are. Most of them are gone now. The last of them are leaving us, the couriers and the operators and the saboteurs and the ones who simply hit a stranger in the attic and said nothing for 60 years. Soon there will be none left who remember it in their own bodies, who can tell you what the fear actually felt like, what the silence of an occupied town actually sounded like, what it cost to tap out a message knowing the vans were closing in. When the last of them goes, all that will remain is the record, the testimonies, the files, the wall of names in the village square, the candles that strangers still light at the foot of a monument on a cold autumn evening for people they never met. All that will remain is what we choose to remember. And that is the thing, in the end, that the whole of this story has been asking of you. Memory is not automatic. It is not preserved by the passage of time. Time erases, time buries, time turns the most agonizing sacrifice into a paragraph in a textbook that no one reads. Memory is a choice. It is a thing the living do deliberately on behalf of the dead who can no longer do it for themselves. The agents who never came home, the villages that paid in blood for the courage of their neighbors, the quiet survivors who went back to ordinary lives and carried the war inside them in silence. They cannot ask you to remember them. They are past asking. So someone has to choose to do it without being asked. That is what a memorial is. That is what these hours have been. These were the people the histories left in the footnotes. The ones who fought the war you never see in the films. Not on the beaches, not in the skies, but in the cellars and the attics and the post offices and the quiet farmhouse kitchens of occupied Europe, with nothing but nerve and a forged document and a refusal to consent. They asked for nothing. Most of them got nothing, no medal, no statue, no mention in the books your children will be handed. They are the people history chose to forget. Subscribe so we don't. There are more of them than any one film could hold. More forgotten names, more buried stories, more ordinary people who did the extraordinary thing in the dark and were never thanked for it. We will go and find them one by one, and we will say their names out loud here where someone is finally listening. That is the work. That is the front that was never reported. Stay with us, and we'll keep it. Every story, every name, every candle lit against the long forgetting. Because the dead cannot remember themselves. That was always going to be our job. Thank you for staying to the end. Good night.